Part 5. Katorga. Chapter 1. The Doomed. Revolution is often rash in its generosity. It is such a hurry to disown so much. Take the word Katorga, for instance. Now, Katorga is a good word, a word with some weight in it. It means hard labor, or penal servitude, and it was in use during the time of the Tsars. Katorga descends from the judicial bench like a blade of a guillotine, stops short of beheading the prisoner but breaks his spine, shatters all hope there is, and then in the courtroom. Stalin was very fond of old words, and 26 years after the February Revolution had abolished Katorga, Stalin reintroduced it. Little attempt was made to conceal the purpose of these Katorga camps. The Katorzane were to be done to death. These were, undisguisedly, murder camps. But in the Gulag tradition, murder was protracted, so that the doomed would suffer longer and put in a little work before they died. They were housed in tents, 7 meters by 20, of the kind common in the north. Surrounded with boards and sprinkled with sawdust, the tent became a sort of flimsy hut. It was meant to hold 80 people, if they were on bunk beds, or 100 on sleeping platforms. But Katorzane were put into them 200 at a time. Yet there was no reduction in average living space, just a rational utilization of accommodation. The Katorzane were put on a 12-hour working day with 2 shifts and no rest days, so that there were always 100 at work and 100 in the hut. At work they were cordoned off by guards with dogs, beaten whenever anyone felt like it, urged on to greater efforts by Tommy guns. On their way back to the living area, their ranks might be raked with Tommy gun fire for no good reason, and the soldiers would not have to answer for the casualties. Even at a distance, a column of exhausted Katorzane was easily identified. No ordinary prisoners dragged themselves so hopelessly, so painfully along. Their 12 working hours were measured out in full to the last tedious minute. Those quarrying stone for road making in the polar blizzards of Norilsk were allowed 10 minutes for a warm-up once in the course of a 12-hour shift. And then their 12-hour rest was wasted in the silliest way imaginable. Part of these 12 hours went into moving them from one camp area to another, parading them, searching them. Once in the living area, they were immediately taken into a tent, which was never ventilated, a windowless hut, and locked in. In winter, a foul, sour stench hung so heavy in the damp air that no one unused to it could endure it for 2 minutes. The living area was even less accessible to the Katorzane than the camp work area. They were never allowed to go to the latrine, nor to the mess hut, nor to the medical section. All their needs were served by the latrine bucket and the feeding hatch. Such was Stalin's Katorga as it took shape in 1943 to 1944, a combination of all that was worst in the camps with all that was worst in the prisons. Their 12 hours of rest also included inspections, morning and evening, a full and formal roll call. Then again, food was distributed twice in the course of these 12 hours. Mess tins were passed through the feeding hatch, and through the feeding hatch they were collected again. According to the camp records, which were not meant to preserve for history the fact that the political prisoners were also starved to death, they were entitled to supplementary miners' rations and bonus dishes, which were miserable enough even before 3 lots of thieves got at them. This was another lengthy procedure conducted through the feeding hatch. Names were called out one by one, and dishes exchanged for coupons. And when at last you were about to collapse onto the sleeping platform and fall asleep, the hatch would drop again. Once again, names were called, and they would start reissuing the same coupons for use the next day. So out of the 12 leisure hours in the cell, barely 4 remained for undisturbed sleep. Then again, Katorzane were of course paid no money, nor had they any right to receive parcels or letters. The Katorzane responded nicely to this treatment and quickly died. But I can already hear angry cries from my compatriots and contemporaries. Stop! Who are these people of whom you dare to speak? Yes, they were to be destroyed, and rightly so. Why, these were traitors, police, burgomasters. They got what they asked for. Surely you are not sorry for them? And the women there were German bedstraw. I hear women's voices crying. First, a few words about our women. Did the whole world of literature, before Stalin, rapturously proclaim that love could not be contained by national boundaries, by the will of generals and diplomats? But once again we have adopted Stalin's yardstick. Except as decreed by the Supreme Soviet, thou shalt not mate. Your body is, first and foremost, the property of the fatherland. Before we go any further, how old were these women when they closed with the enemy in bed instead of in battle? Certainly under 30, and often no more than 25, which means that from their first childhood impression onward they had been educated after the October Revolution, been brought up in Soviet schools and on Soviet ideology, so that our anger was for the work of our own hands. Some of these girls had taken to heart what we had tirelessly dinned into them for 15 years on end, that there was no such thing as one owns country, that the fatherland is a reactionary fiction. Others had grown a little bored with our puritanical Lenten fare of meetings, conferences, and demonstrations, of films without kisses and dancing at arm's length. And yet others were simply hungry. Yes, hungry, in the most primitive sense. They had nothing to put in their bellies. But who is to really blame for all this? Who, I ask you? Those women? Or fellow countrymen, contemporaries, we ourselves, all of us? What was it in us that made the occupying troops much more attractive to our women? Was this not one of the innumerable penalties which we are continually paying, and will be paying for a long time yet, for the path we so hastily chose and have so stumblingly followed, with never a look back at our losses, never a cautious look ahead? All right then, but the men at least were in for good reasons. They were traitors to their country and to their class. Since we have begun, let us go on. What about the school teachers? Those whom our army in its panicky recoil abandoned with their schools and pupils for a year, for 2 years, or even 3. The quartermasters had been stupid, the generals no good, so what must the teachers do now? Teach their children or not teach them? And what were the kids to do? Not kids of 15 who could earn a wage or join the partisans, but the little kids. Learn their lessons or live like sheep for 2 or 3 years to atone for the Supreme Commander's mistakes? If Daddy doesn't give you a cap, you let your ears freeze. Is that it? For some reason, no such question ever arose, either in Denmark or in Norway or in Belgium or in France. In those countries it was not felt that a people placed under German rule by its own foolish government, or by force of overwhelming circumstances, must thereupon stop living altogether. In those countries schools went on working, as did railways and local government. Somebody's brains, theirs of course, are 180 degrees out of true. Because in our country teachers received anonymous letters from the partisans. Don't dare teach, you will be made to pay for it. Working on the railways also became collaboration with the enemy. As for participation in the local administration, that was treason, unprecedented in its enormity. Everybody knows that a child who once drops out of school may never return to it. Just because the greatest strategic genius of all times and all nations had made a blooper, was the grass to wither till he righted it, or could it keep growing? Should children be taught in the meantime, or shouldn't they? Of course, a price would have to be paid. Pictures of the big mustache would have to be taken out of school, and pictures of the little mustache perhaps brought in. The children would gather round the tree at Christmas instead of New Year's, and at this ceremony, as also on some imperial anniversaries substituted for that of the October Revolution, the headmaster would have to deliver a speech in praise of the splendid new life, however bad things really were. But similar speeches have been made in the past, and life had been just as bad then. Or rather, you had to be more of a hypocrite before, had to tell the children many more lies, because the lies had had time to mature, and to permeate the syllabus in versions painstakingly elaborated by experts on teaching technique and by school inspectors. In every lesson, whether it was pertinent or not, whether you were studying the anatomy of worms or the use of conjunctions in complete sentences, you were required to take a kick at God, even if you yourself believed in him. You could not omit singing the praises of our boundless freedom, even if you had lain awake expecting a knock in the night. Whether you were reading Turgenev to the class or tracing the course of the Dnieper with your ruler, you had to anathematize the poverty-stricken past and hymn our present plenty, though long before the war you and the children had watched whole villages dying of hunger, and in the towns a child's ration had been 300 grams. None of this was considered a sin against the truth, against the soul of the child, or against the Holy Ghost. Whereas now, under the temporary and still unsettled occupation regime, far fewer lies had to be told. But they stood the old ones on their heads. That was the trouble. So it was that the voice of the fatherland and the pencil of the underground party committee forbade you to teach children their native language, geography, arithmetic, and science. 20 years of Katorga for work of that sort. Fellow countrymen, nod your heads in agreement. There they go, guards with dogs alongside, marching to the barracks with their night pails. Stone them. They taught your children. But my fellow countrymen, particularly former members of the specially privileged government departments, retired on pension at 45, advance me on with raised fists. Who is it that I am defending? Those who served the Germans as burgomasters, as village headmen, as police, as interpreters, all kinds of filth and scum? Well, let us go a little deeper. We have done far too much damage by looking at people as entries in a table. Whether we like it or not, the future will force us to reflect on the reasons for their behavior. When they started playing and singing Let Noble Rage, what spine did not tingle? Our natural patriotism, long banned, howled down, under fire, anathematized, was suddenly permitted, encouraged, praised as sacred. What Russian heart did not leap up, swell with grateful longing for unity? How could we, with our natural magnanimity, help forgiving in spite of everything the native butchers as the foreign butchers drew near? Later, the need for drown half-conscious misgivings about our impulsive generosity made us all the more unanimous and violent in cursing the traitors, people plainly worse than ourselves, people incapable of forgiveness. Russia has stood for 11 centuries, known many foes, waged many wars. But have there been many traitors in Russia? Did traitors ever leave the country in crowds? I think not. I do not think that even their foes ever accused the Russians of being traitors, turncoats, renegades, though they lived under a regime inimical to ordinary working people. Then came the most righteous war in our history. To a country with a supremely just social order, and tens of hundreds of thousands of our people stood revealed as traitors. Where did they all come from, and why? Perhaps the unextinguished embers of the Civil War had flared up again. Perhaps these were whites who had not escaped extermination. No. I had mentioned before that many white emigres took sides with the Soviet Union and against Hitler. They had freedom of choice, and that is what they chose. These tens and hundreds of thousands, police and executioners, headmen and interpreters, were all ordinary Soviet citizens. And there were many young people among them who had grown up since the revolution. What made them do it? What sort of people were they? For the most part, people who had fallen, themselves and their families, under the caterpillar tracks of the 20s and 30s. People who had lost parents, relatives, loved ones in the turbid streams of our sewage system, or who themselves had time and again sunk and struggled to the surface in the camps and places of banishment. People who knew well enough what it was to stand with feet numb and frostbitten in the queue at the parcels window. People who in those cruel decades had found themselves severed, brutally cut off from the most precious thing on earth, the land itself, though it had been promised to them, incidentally, by the great decree of 1917, and though they had been called upon to shed their blood for it in the Civil War. Quite another matter are the country residences bought and bequeathed by Soviet officers, the fenced-in manorial domains outside Moscow. That's ours, so it's all right. Then some people had been seized for snipping ears of wheat or rye, and some deprived of the right to live where they wished, or the right to follow a long-practiced and well-loved trade. No one now remembers how fanatically we persecuted craftsmen. All such people are spoken of nowadays, especially by the professional agitators and the proletarian vigilantes of October, with a contemptuous compression of the lips, people with a grudge against the Soviet state, formerly repressed persons, sons of the former kulak class, people secretly harboring black resentment of the Soviet power. One says it, and another nods his head, as though it explained anything, as though the people's state had the right to offend its citizens, as though this were the essential defect, the root of the evil. People with a grudge, secretly resentful. And no one cries out, "How can you? Damn your insolence! Do you or do you not hold that being determines consciousness? Or only when it suits you, and when it doesn't suit you does it cease to be true?" Then again, some of us are very good at saying, and a shadow flits over our faces, well, yes, certain errors were committed. Always the same disingenuously innocent, impersonal form. Were committed. Only nobody knows by whom. You might also think that it was by ordinary workers, by men who shift heavy loads, by collective farmers. Nobody has the courage to say, "The party committed them. Our irremovable and irresponsible leaders committed them." Yet by whom, except those who had power, could such errors be committed? Lump all the blame on Stalin? Have you no sense of humor? If Stalin committed all these errors, where were you at the time, you ruling millions? In any case, even these mistakes have faded into our eyes to a dim, shapeless blur, and they are no longer regarded as the result of stupidity, fanaticism, and malice. They are all subsumed in the only mistake acknowledged, that communists jailed communists. If 15 to 17 million peasants were ruined, sent off for destruction, scattered about the country without the right to remember their parents or mention them by name, that was apparently no mistake. And all the tributary streams of the sewage system surveyed at the beginning of this book were also, it seems, no mistake. That they were utterly unprepared for war with Hitler, emptily vainglorious, that they retreated shamefully, changing their slogans as they ran, that only Ivan fighting for Holy Russia halted the Germans on the Volga, all this turns out to be not a silly blunder, but possibly Stalin's greatest achievement. In the space of 2 months, we abandoned very nearly 1/3 of our population to the enemy, including all those incompletely destroyed families, including camps with several thousand inmates, who scattered as soon as their guards ran for it, including prisons in the Ukraine and the Baltic states, where smoke still hung in the air after mass shooting of political prisoners. As long as we were strong, we smothered these unfortunates, hounded them, denied them work, drove them from their homes, hurried them into their graves. When our weakness was revealed, we immediately demanded that they should forget all the harm done them, forget the parents and the children who had died of hunger in the tundra, forget the executions, forget how he ruined them, forget our ingratitude to them, forget interrogation and torture at the hands of the NKVD, forget the starvation camps, and immediately join the partisans, go underground to defend the homeland, with no thought for their lives. There was no need for us to change, and no one held out the hope that when we came back we should treat them any differently, no longer hounding, harassing, jailing, and shooting them. Given this state of affairs, should we be surprised that too many people welcomed the arrival of the Germans, or surprised that there were so few who did? And the believers? For 20 years on end, religious belief was persecuted and churches closed down. The Germans came, and the churches began to open their doors. Our masters lacked the nerve to shut them down again immediately after the German withdrawal. In Rostov-on-the-Don, for instance, the ceremonial opening of the churches was an occasion for mass rejoicing and great crowds gathered. Were they nonetheless supposed to curse the Germans for this? In Rostov again, in the first days of the war, Alexander Petrovich, M., an engineer, was arrested and died in a cell under interrogation. For several anxious months his wife expected to be arrested herself. Only when the Germans came could she go to bed with a quiet mind. Now at least I can have some sleep. Should she instead have prayed for the return of her tormentors? In May 1943, while the Germans were in Willetts, men digging in an orchard on the Poslanaya Street, which the city's Soviet had surrounded with a high fence early in 1939 and declared a restricted area under the People's Commissariat of Defense, found themselves uncovering graves which had previously escaped notice because they were overgrown with luxuriant grass. They found 39 mass graves, 3.5 meters deep, 3 meters wide, 4 meters long. In each grave they found a first layer of outer garments belonging to the deceased, then bodies laid alternately head first or feet first. The hands of all of them were tied with rope, and they had all been shot by small-bore pistols in the back of the head. They had evidently been executed in prison and carted out for burial by night. Documents which had not decayed made it possible to identify people who had been sentenced to 20 years without the right to correspond in 1938. One picture of the excavation site. Inhabitants of Willetts have come here to view the bodies or identify their relatives. There was more to come. In June they began digging near the Orthodox cemetery, outside the Pirogov Hospital, and discovered another 42 graves. Next, the Gorky Park of Culture and Rest, where, under the swings and carousel, the fun house, the games area, and the dance floor, 14 more mass graves were found. Altogether, 9,439 corpses in 95 graves. This was in Willetts alone, and the discoveries were accidental. How many lie successfully hidden in other towns? After viewing these corpses, were the population supposed to rush off and join the partisans? Perhaps in fairness we should at least admit that if you and I suffer when we and all we hold dear are trodden underfoot, those we tread on feel no less pain. Perhaps in fairness we should at least admit that those whom we seek to destroy have a right to hate us. Or have they no such right? Are they supposed to die gratefully? We attribute deep-seated, if not indeed congenital malice to these polizei, these burgomasters, but we ourselves planted their malice in them. They were waste products of our making. How does Krylenko's dictum go? In our eyes, every crime is the product of a particular social system. In this case, of your system, comrades. Don't forget your own doctrine. Let us not forget either that among those of our fellow countrymen who took up the sword against us or attacked us in words, some were completely disinterested. No property had been taken from them. They had none to begin with. They had never been imprisoned in the camps, nor yet had any of their kin. But they had long ago been sickened by our whole system, its contempt for the fate of the individual, the persecution of people for their beliefs, that cynical song, "There's no land where men can breathe so freely," the kowtowing of the devout to the leader, the nervous twitching of pencils as everyone hurries to sign up for the state loan, the obligatory applause rising to an ovation. Cannot we realize that these perfectly normal people could not breathe our fetid air? Father Fyodor Floria's accusers asked him how he had dared talk about Stalin's foul deeds when the Romanians were on the spot. "How could I say anything different about you?" he answered. "I only told them what I knew. I only told them what had happened. What we ask is something different. Lie. Go against your conscience. Perish, just so long as it helps us. But this, unless I'm mistaken, is hardly materialism." Mankind is almost incapable of dispassionate, unemotional thinking. In something which he has recognized as evil, man can seldom force himself to see also what is good. Not everything in our lives was foul, not every word in the papers was false, but the minority, downtrodden, bullied, beset by stool pigeons, saw life in our country as an abomination from top to bottom, saw every page in the newspapers as one long lie. We have been talking about the towns, but we should not forget the countryside. Liberals nowadays commonly reproach the village with its political obtusiveness and conservatism, but before the war the village, to a man, or overwhelmingly, was sober, much more sober than the town. It took no part at all in the deification of Daddy Stalin, and, needless to say, had no time for the world revolution either. The village was, quite simply, sane and remembered clearly how it had been promised land, then robbed of it, how it had lived, eaten, and dressed before and after collectivization, how calves, ewes, and even hens had been taken away from the peasant's yard, how churches had been desecrated and defiled. Even in 1941 the radio's nasal bray was not yet heard in peasant huts, and not every village had even one person able to read the newspapers. So that to the Russian countryside all those Chang So-lins, MacDonalds, and Hitlers were indistinguishably strange and meaningless lay figures. In a village in Ryazan province on July 3, 1941, peasants gathered near the smithy were listening to Stalin's speech relayed by a loudspeaker. The man of iron, hitherto unmoved by the tears of Russian peasants, was now a bewildered old gaffer almost in tears himself, and as soon as he blurted out his humbugging "brothers and sisters," one of the peasants answered the black paper mouthpiece. "This is what you want, you bastard!" And he made in the direction of the loudspeaker a rude gesture much favored by Russians. One hand grips the opposite elbow, and the forearm rises and falls in a pumping motion. The peasants all roared with laughter. If we questioned eyewitnesses in every village, we should learn of the 10,000 such incidents, some still more pungent. Such was the mood of the Russian village at the beginning of the war. The mood, then, of the reservists drinking the last half-liter and dancing in the dust with their kinsmen while they waited at some wayside halt for a train. On top of all of this came a defeat without precedent in Russian memories, as vast rural areas stretching to the outskirts of both capitals and to the Volga, as many millions of peasants slipping from under Kolka's rule, and, why go on lying and prettifying history? It turned out that the republics only wanted independence. The village only wanted freedom from the Kolkas. The workers' freedom from feudal decrees. But now, since further postponement is impossible, should I not also talk about those who even before 1941 had only one dream, to take up arms and blaze away at those red commissars, Chekists, and collectivizers? Remember Lenin's words. An oppressed class which did not aspire to possess arms and learn how to handle them would deserve only to be treated as slaves. There is, then, reason to be proud if the Soviet-German war showed that we are not such slaves as all those studies by liberal historians contemptuously make us out to be. There was nothing slavish about those who reached for their sabers to cut off Daddy Stalin's head, nor about those on the other side who straightened their backs for the first time when they put on the Red Army greatcoats, in a strange brief interval of freedom which no student of society could have foreseen. These people, who had experienced on their own hides 24 years of communist happiness, knew by 1941 what as yet no one else in the world knew, that nowhere on the planet, nowhere in history, Was there a regime more vicious, more bloodthirsty, and at the same time more cunning and ingenious than the Bolshevik, the self-styled Soviet regime? That no other regime on earth could compare it with either in the number of those it had done to death, in hardiness, in the range of its ambitions, in its thoroughgoing and unmitigated totalitarianism. No, not even the regime of its pupil Hitler, which at the time blinded Western eyes to all else. Came the time when weapons were put in the hands of these people. Should they have curbed their passions, allowed Bolshevism to outlive itself, steeled themselves to cruel oppression again, and only then begun the struggle with it? A struggle which has still hardly started anywhere in the world. No, the natural thing was to copy the methods of Bolshevism itself. It had eaten into a body of Russia sapped by the First World War, and it must be defeated at a similar moment in the Second. The Germans were met with bread and salt in the villages on the Don. The pre-1941 population of the Soviet Union naturally imagined that the coming of a foreign army meant the overthrow of the communist regime. Otherwise, it could have no meaning for us at all. People expected a political program which would liberate them from Bolshevism. From where we were, separated from them by the wilderness of Soviet propaganda, by the dense mass of Hitler's army, how could we readily believe that the Western Allies had entered this war not for the sake of freedom in general, but for their own Western European freedom, only against Nazism, intending to take full advantage of the Soviet armies and leave it at that? Was it not more natural for us to believe that our allies were true to the very principle of freedom, and that they would not abandon us to a worse tyranny? True, these were the same allies for whom Russians had died in the First World War, and who then, too, hastening back to their comforts. But this was a lesson too cruel for the heart to learn. Even in 1943, tens of thousands of refugees from the Soviet provinces trailed along behind the retreating German army. Anything was better than remaining under communism. I will go so far as to say that our folk would have been worth nothing at all, a nation of abject slaves, if it had gone through that war without brandishing a rifle at Stalin's government even from afar, if it had missed its chance to shake its fist and fling a ripe oath at the father of the peoples. The Germans had their generals' plot, but what did we have? Our generals were, and remain to this day, non-entities, corrupted by party ideology and greed, and have not preserved in their own persons the spirit of the nation, as happens in other countries. So that those who raised their hands and struck were almost to a man from the lowest levels of society. The number of former gentry emigres, former members of the wealthier strata, and intellectuals taking part was microscopically small. Chekhov complained that we had no legal definition of Katorga, or of its purpose. But that was in the enlightened 19th century. In the middle of the 20th, the caveman century, we didn't even feel the need to understand and define. Old man Stalin had decided that it would be so, and that was all the definition necessary. We just nodded our heads in understanding. End of Part 5, Chapter 1. Part 5, Chapter 2. The First Whiff of Revolution. This chapter, which touches on several themes, including Russian-Ukrainian relations, in the end focuses on the increasing spirit of resistance, the vague mutinous anticipations which had grown in us, among the prisoners. End of Part 5, Chapter 2. Part 5, Chapter 3. Chains. Chains. Our eager hopes, our leaping expectations, were soon crushed. The wind of change was only blowing in drafty corridors, in the transit prisons. Here, behind the tall fences of the special camps, its breath did not reach us, and although there were only political prisoners in these camps, no mutinous leaflets hung on posts. They say that at Minleg the blacksmiths refused to forge bars for hut windows. All glory to those as yet nameless heroes. The special camps began with that uncomplaining, indeed eager submission to which prisoners had been trained by 3 generations of corrective labor camps. Prisoners brought in from the polar north had no cause to be grateful for the Kazakh sunshine. At Novorudnoy station, they jumped down from the red boxcars onto ground no less red. This was the famous Jezkazgan copper, and the lungs of those who mined it never held out more than 4 months. There and then, the warders joyfully demonstrated their new weapon on the first prisoners to step out of line. Handcuffs, which had not been used in the corrective labor camps. Gleaming nickel handcuffs, which went into mass production in the Soviet Union to mark the 13th anniversary of the October Revolution. These handcuffs were remarkable in that they could be clamped on very tight. Serrated metal plates were let into them, so that when a camp guard banged a man's handcuffed wrists against his knee, more of the teeth would slip into the lock, causing the prisoner greater pain. In this way, the handcuffs became an instrument of torture instead of a mere device to inhibit activity. They crushed the wrists, causing constant acute pain, and prisoners were kept like that for hours, always with their hands behind their backs, palms outward. The warders also perfected the practice of trapping forefingers in the handcuffs, which caused acute pain in the finger joints. In Burlag, the handcuffs were used religiously. For every trifle, even for failure to take off your cap to a warder, they put on the handcuffs, hands behind the back, and stood you by the guardhouse. The hands became swollen and numb, and grown men wept. "I won't do it again, sir. Please take the cuffs off." It was easy enough for someone to scribble the order, establish special camps, submit draft regulations by such and such a date. But somewhere, hard-working penologists, and psychologists, and connoisseurs of camp life, had to think out the details. How could screws already galling to be made yet tighter? How could burdens already back-breaking be made yet heavier? How could the lives of Gulag's denizens, already far from easy, be made harder yet? Transferred from corrective labor camps to special camps, these animals must be aware at once of their strictness and harshness. But obviously someone must first devise a detailed program. Then again, they quite blatantly borrowed from the Nazis a practice which had proved valuable to them. The substitution of a number for the prisoner's name, his I, his human individuality, so that the difference between one man and another was a digit more or less in an otherwise identical row of figures. This measure, too, could be a great hardship, provided it was implemented consistently and fully. This they tried to do. Every new recruit, when he played the piano in the special section, i.e., had his fingerprints taken, as was the practice in ordinary prisons, but not in corrective labor camps, had to hang around his neck a board suspended from a rope. And in this guise he had his picture taken by the special section's photographer. All those photographs are still preserved somewhere. One of these days we shall see them. In work rolls, too, it was the rule to write numbers before names. Why before and not instead of names? They were afraid to give up names altogether. However you look at it, a name is a reliable handle. A man is pegged to his name forever, whereas a number is blown away at a puff. If only the numbers were branded or picked out on the man himself, that would be something. But they never got around to it. Though they might have easily done so, they came close enough. All this was in 1949, the year 1949, the 32nd year after the October Revolution. 4 years after the war, with its harsh imperatives, had ended, 3 years after the conclusion of the Nuremberg trials, where mankind at large had learned about the horrors of the Nazi camps and said with a sigh of relief, "It can never happen again. It can never happen again." If you remember all this, it may not surprise you to hear that making him wear numbers was not the most hurtful and effective way of damaging a prisoner's self-respect. But there were people for whom the numbers were indeed the most diabolical of the camp's devices. Among them were the devout women members of certain religious sects. These women refused to wear numbers, the mark of Satan. Nor would they be given signed receipts, to Satan, of course, in return for regulation dress. The camp authorities showed laudable firmness. They gave orders that the women should be stripped to their shifts and have their shoes taken from them, thus enlisting Winter's help in forcing these senseless fanatics to accept regulation dress and sew on their numbers. But even with the temperature below freezing, the women walked about the camp in their shifts and barefoot, refusing to surrender their souls to Satan. Faced with this spirit, the spirit of reaction, needless to say, enlightened people like ourselves would never protest so strongly about such a thing, the administration capitulated and gave their clothing back to the sectarians, who put it on without numbers. End of Part 5, Chapter 3. Part 5, Chapter 4. Why did we stand for it? In the conventional cadet, let alone socialist, interpretation, the whole of Russian history is a succession of tyrannies. The Tatar tyranny, the tyranny of the Moscow princes, 5 centuries of indigenous tyranny on the Oriental model, and of a social order firmly and frankly rooted in slavery. Forget about the assemblies of the land, the village commune, the free Cossacks, the free peasantry of the north. Whether it is Ivan the Terrible, Alexis the Gentle, heavy-handed Peter, velvety Catherine, or even Alexander II, until the great February Revolution, all Tsars right up to the Crimean War knew one thing only: how to crush. Only. Crushed, yes, but the word needs qualification. Not crushed in our modern technical sense. After the war with Napoleon, when our army came back from Europe, the first breath of freedom passed over Russian society. Faint as it was, the Tsar had to reckon with it. The common soldiers, for instance, who took part in the Decemberist rising, was a single one of them strung up? Was a single one shot? And in our day, would a single one of them have been left alive? Neither Pushkin nor Lermontov could simply be put inside for a tenor. Roundabout ways of dealing with them had to be found. Whereas all of us have felt on our own hides the workings of a mechanized judicial system. 7 attempts were made on the life of Alexander II himself. What did he do about it? Ruin and banish half Petersburg as it happened after Kirov's murder? You know very well such a thing could never enter his head. Did he apply the methods of prophylactic mass terror? Total terror, as in 1918? Take hostages? The concept didn't exist. Imprison dubious persons? It simply wasn't possible. Execute thousands? They executed 5. Fewer than 300 were convicted by the courts in this period. If just one such attempt had been made on Stalin, how many millions of lives would it have cost us? The Bolshevik Ominsky writes that in 1891 he was the only political prisoner in the whole Kresty prison. Transferred to Moscow, he was the only one in Taganka. He was the only one in the Butyrki, awaiting deportation, that a small party of them was assembled. And a quarter of a century later, the February Revolution revealed the presence of 7 political prisoners in the Odessa Castle prison, and another 3 such prisoners in Mogilev. The Tsars persecuted revolutionaries just sufficiently to broaden their circle of acquaintance in prisons, toughen them, and ring their heads with halos. We now have an accurate yardstick to establish the scale of these phenomena, and we can safely say that the Tsarist government did not persecute revolutionaries, but tenderly nurtured them for its own destruction. The uncertainty, half-heartedness, and feebleness of the Tsarist government are obvious to all those who have experienced an infallible judicial system. Let us examine, for instance, some generally known biographical facts about Lenin. In spring 1887, his brother was executed for an attempt on the life of Alexander III. And what happened to him? In the autumn of that very year, Vladimir Ulyanov was admitted to the Imperial University at Kazan, and what is more, to the law faculty. Surprising, isn't it? True, Vladimir Ulyanov was expelled from the university in the same academic year, but this was for organizing a student demonstration against the government. The younger brother of a would-be regicide inciting students to insubordination? What would he have got for that in our day? He certainly would have been shot, whereas he was merely expelled. Such cruelty. Yes, but he was also banished. To Sakhalin? No, to the family estate of Kukashkino, where he intended to spend the summer anyway. He wanted to work, so they gave him an opportunity. To fell trees in the frozen north? No, to practice law in Samara, where he was simultaneously active in illegal political circles. After this, he was allowed to take his examinations at St. Petersburg University as an external student. With his curriculum vitae, what was the special section thinking of? Then a few years later, this same young revolutionary was arrested for founding, in the capital, a league of struggle for the liberation of the working class, no less. He had repeatedly made seditious speeches to workers, had written political leaflets. Was he tortured? Starved? No, they created for him conditions conducive to intellectual work. In the Petersburg investigation prison, where he was held for a year, and where he was allowed to receive the dozens of books he needed, he wrote the greater part of The Development of Capitalism in Russia, and, moreover, forwarded, legally, through the prosecutor's office, his economic essays to the Marxist journal Novoye Slovo. While in prison, he followed a prescribed diet, could have dinners sent in at his own expense, buy milk, buy mineral water from a chemist's shop, and receive parcels from home 3 times a week. Trotsky, too, was able to put the first draft of his theory of permanent revolution on paper in the Peter and the Paul fortress. But then, of course, he was condemned by a 3-man tribunal and shot? No, he wasn't even jailed, only banished. To Yakutia, then, for life? No, to a land of plenty, Minusинsk, and for 3 years. He was taken there in handcuffs, in a prison train? Not at all. He traveled like a free man, went around Petersburg for 3 days without interference, then did the same in Moscow. He had to leave instructions for clandestine correspondence, establish connections, hold a conference of revolutionaries still at large. He was even allowed to go into exile at his own expense, that is, to travel with free passengers. Lenin never sampled a single convict train or a single transit prison on his way out to Siberia, or, of course, on the return journey. Then, in Krasnoyarsk, 2 more months' work in the library saw The Development of Capitalism finished. And this book, written by a political exile, appeared in print without obstruction from the censorship. Measure that by our yardstick. But what would he live on in that remote village, where he would obviously find no work? He asked for an allowance from the state, and they paid him more than he needed. It would have been impossible to create better conditions than Lenin enjoyed in his one and only period of banishment. A healthy diet, at extremely low prices, plenty of meat, a sheep every week, milk, vegetables, he could hunt to his heart's content. When he was dissatisfied with his dog, friends seriously considered sending him one from Petersburg. When mosquitoes bit him while he was out hunting, he ordered kid gloves. He was cured of his gastric disorders and the other illnesses of his youth, and rapidly put on weight. He had no obligations, no work to do, no duties, nor did his womenfolk exert themselves. For 2.5 rubles a month, a 15-year-old peasant girl did all the rough work about in the house. Lenin had no need to write for money, turned down offers of paid work from Petersburg, and wrote only things which could bring him literary fame. He served his term of banishment. He could have escaped without difficulty, but was too circumspect for that. Was his sentence automatically extended? Converted to deportation for life? How could it be? That would have been illegal. He was given permission to reside in Pskov, on the condition that he did not visit the capital. He did visit Riga and Smolensk. He was not under surveillance. Then he and his friend, Martov, took a basket of forbidden literature to the capital, traveling via Tsarskoye Selo, Where there were particularly strict controls, they had been too clever by half, he was picked up in Petersburg. True, he no longer had the basket, but he did have a letter to Plekhanov in invisible ink with the whole plan for launching Iskra. The police, though, could not put themselves to all that trouble. He was under arrest and in a cell for 3 weeks. The letter was in their hands, and it remained undeciphered. What was the result of this unauthorized absence from Pskov? 20 years' hard labor, as it would have been in our time? No, just those 3 weeks under arrest, after which he was freed completely, to travel around Russia setting up distribution centers for Iskra, then abroad to arrange publication. The police see no objection to granting him a passport for foreign travel. But this was the least of it. As an emigre, he would send home to Russia an article on Marx for the Granite Encyclopedia, and it would be printed. Nor was it the only one. Finally, he carried on subversive activity from a little town in Austrian Poland near the Russian frontier, but no one sent undercover thugs to abduct him and bring him back alive, though it would have been the easiest thing in the world. Tsardom was always weak and irresolute in the pursuit of his enemies. The most important special feature of persecution, if you can call it that, in Tsarist times was perhaps just this, that the revolutionaries' relatives never suffered in the least. Any member of the Ulyanov family, though nearly all of them were arrested at one time or another, could readily obtain permission to go abroad at any moment. When Lenin was on the wanted list for his exhortations to armed uprising, his sister Anna legally and regularly transferred money to his account with the Credit Lyonnais in Paris. Such were the circumstances in which Tolstoy came to believe that only moral self-improvement was necessary, not political freedom. Of course, no one is in need of freedom if he already has it. We can agree with him that political freedom is not what matters in the end. The goal of human evolution is not freedom for the sake of freedom, nor is it the building of an ideal polity. What matter, of course, are the moral foundations of society. But that is in the long run. What about the beginning? What about the first step? Yasnaya Polyana in those days was an open club for thinkers, but if it had been blockaded as Akhmatova's apartment was when every visitor was asked for his passport, if Tolstoy had been pressed as hard as we all were in Stalin's time, when 3 men feared to come together under one roof, even he would have demanded political freedom. Russian public opinion by the beginning of the century constituted a marvelous force, was creating a climate of freedom. The defeat of Tsarism came not when Kolchak was routed, not when the February Revolution was raging, but much earlier. It was overthrown without hope of restoration once Russian literature adopted the convention that anyone who depicted a gendarme or policeman with any hint of sympathy was a lick-spittle and a reactionary thug. When you didn't have to shake a policeman's hand, cultivate his acquaintance, nod to him in the street, but merely brush sleeves with him in passing to consider yourself disgraced. Whereas we have butchers who, because they are now redundant and because their qualifications are right, are in charge of literature and culture. They order us to extol them as legendary heroes, and to do so is for the same reason called patriotism. The reason why we put up with it all in the camps is that there was no public opinion outside. What conceivable ways has the prisoner of resisting the regime to which he is subjected? Obviously, they are 1. Protest. 2. Hunger strike. 3. Escape. 4. Mutiny. So then, it is obvious to anybody, as the great deceased liked to say, and if it isn't, we'll ram it into him, that if the first 2 have some force, and if the jailers fear them, it is only because of public opinion. Without that behind us, we can protest and fast as much as we like, and they will laugh in our faces. It is a very dramatic way of obtaining your demands, standing before the prison authorities and tearing open your shirt, as Dzerzhinsky did. But only where public opinion exists. Without it, you'll be gagged with the tatters and pay for a government-issue shirt into the bargain. Let me remind you of a celebrated event which took place in the Kara hard labor prison at the end of the last century. Political prisoners were informed that in the future they will be liable to corporal punishment. Nadezhda Sigida was due to be thrashed first. She had slapped the commandant's face to force him to resign. She took poison and died rather than submit to the birch. 3 other women then poisoned themselves, and also died. In the men's barracks, 14 prisoners volunteered to commit suicide, though not all of them succeeded. As a result, corporal punishment was abolished outright and forever. The prisoners had counted on frightening the prison authorities, for news of the tragedy at Kara would reach Russia and the whole world. You see from what a lofty plane prison behavior has declined, and how low we have fallen. And now by the same token our jailers have risen in the world. No, these are not the bumpkins of Kara. Even if we had plucked up our courage and risen above ourselves, 4 women and 14 men, we should all have been shot before we got at any poison. If you did manage to poison yourself, you would only make the task of authorities easier, and the rest would be treated to a dose of the birch for not denouncing you, and needless to say, no word of the occurrence would ever leak through the boundary wires. This is the point. This is where their power lies. No news could leak out. If some muffled rumor did, with no confirmation from the newspapers, with informers busily nosing it out, it would not get far enough to matter. There would be no outburst of public indignation. So what is there to fear? So why should they lend an ear to our protests? If you want to poison yourselves, get on with it. Escape, then? History has preserved for us accounts of some major escapes from the Tsarist prisons. All of them, let us note, were engineered and directed from outside by other revolutionaries, party comrades of the escapers, with incidental help from many sympathizers. Many people were involved in the escape itself, in concealing the escapers afterward, and in slipping them across the frontier. Perhaps it was all a jolly game, and a legal one. Fluttering your handkerchief from a window, letting a runaway share your bedroom, helping him with his disguise. These were not indictable offenses. When Pyotr Lavrov ran away from his place of banishment, the governor of Vologda, Kaminsky, gave his new civil law wife permission to leave and catch up with her man. Even for forging passports, you could be rusticated to your own farm, as we saw. People were not afraid. I have at present no access to information about security at the principal locations of the Tsarist Katorga, but if escape from them was ever as desperately difficult as it was from their Soviet counterparts, with 1 chance in 100,000 of success, I have never heard it. There was obviously no reason for prisoners to take great risks. They were not threatened with premature death from exhaustion by hard labor, nor with extensions of sentence which they had done nothing to deserve. The second half of their term they served not in prison, but in places of banishment, and they usually put off escapes till then. Laziness would seem to be the only reason for not escaping from Tsarist places of banishment. Escape in our time has always been an enterprise for giants among men, but for doomed giants. Such daring, such ingenuity, such willpower never went into pre-revolutionary escape attempts, yet they were very often successful, and ours hardly ever. The reason for our failure was that success depends in the later stages of the attempt on the attitude of the population, and our population was afraid to help escapers, or even betrayed them, for mercenary or ideological reasons. So much for public opinion. As for prison mutinies involving as many as 3, 5, or 8,000 men, the history of our 3 revolutions knew nothing of them. Yet we did. But the same curse was upon them, and very great efforts, very great sacrifices, produced the most trivial results. Because society was not ready. Because without a response from public opinion, A mutiny, even in a huge camp, has no scope for development. So that when we are asked, "Why did you put up with it?" it is time to answer, "But we didn't." Read on, and you will see that we didn't put up with it at all. In the special camps, we raised the banner of the politicals, and politicals we became. End of Part 5, Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Poetry under a tombstone, truth under a stone. At the very beginning of my camp career, I was very anxious to avoid general duties, but did not know how. When I arrived at Ekibistas in the 6th year of my imprisonment, I had changed completely, and set out at once to cleanse my mind of the camp prejudices, intrigues, and schemes, which leave it no time for deeper matters. So that instead of resigning myself to the grueling existence of a general laborer until I was lucky enough to become a trustee, as educated people usually have to, I resolved to acquire a skill, there and then, in Katorga. When we joined Boronyuk's team, Oleg Ivanov and I, a suitable trade, that of bricklayer, came our way. Later my fortunes took a different turn, and I was for some time a smelter. I was anxious and unsure of myself to begin with. Could I keep it up? We were unhandy cerebral creatures, and the same amount of work was harder for us than for our teammates. But the day when I deliberately let myself sink to the bottom, and felt it firm under my feet, the hard, rocky bottom, which is the same for all, was the beginning of my most important years of my life, the years which put the finishing touches to my character. From then onward, there seemed to have been no upheavals in my life, and I have been faithful to the views and habits acquired at that time. I needed an unmuddled mind, because I had been trying to write a poem for 2 years past. This was very rewarding, in that it helped me not to notice what was being done with my body. Sometimes in a sullen work party with Tommy gunners barking about me, lines and images crowded in so urgently that I felt myself borne through the air, overleaping the column in my hurry to reach the work site and find a corner to write. At such moments I was both free and happy. But how could I write in a special camp? Memory was the only hidey-hole in which you could keep what you had written and carry it through all the searches and journeys under escort. In the early days I had little confidence in the powers of memory, and decided, therefore, to write in verse. It was, of course, an abuse of the genre. I discovered later that prose, too, can be quite satisfactorily tamped down into the deep hidden layers of what we carry in our head. No longer burdened with frivolous and superfluous knowledge, a prisoner's memory is astonishingly capacious and can expand indefinitely. We have too little faith in memory. I started breaking matches into little pieces and arranging them on my cigarette case in 2 rows, of 10 each, one representing units and the other tens. As I recited the verses to myself, I displaced 1 bit of broken match from the unit's row for every line. When I had shifted 10 units, I displaced 1 of the tens. Every 50th and every 100th line I memorized with special care, to help me keep count. Once a month I recited all that I had written. If the wrong line came out in place of one of the 100s or 50s, I went over it all again and again until I caught the slippery fugitives. In the Kubyshev transit prison I saw Catholics, Lithuanians, busy making themselves rosaries for prison use. They made them by soaking bread, kneading beads from it, coloring them, black ones with burnt rubber, white ones with tooth powder, red ones with red germicide, stringing them while still moist on several strands of thread, twisted together and thoroughly soaped, and letting them dry on the window ledge. I joined them and said that I, too, wanted to say my prayers with a rosary, but that in my particular religion I needed 100 beads and a ring. Later, when I realized that 20 would suffice, and indeed be more convenient, I made them myself from cork. That every 10th bead must be cubic, not spherical, and that the 50th and 100th beads must be distinguishable at a touch. The Lithuanians were amazed by my religious zeal. But with true brotherly love, they helped me put together a rosary such as I had described, making the 100th bead in the form of a dark red heart. I never afterward parted with this marvelous present of theirs. I fingered and counted my beads inside my wide mittens, at work line-up, on the march to and from work, and at all waiting times. I could do it standing up, and freezing cold was no hindrance. I carried it safely through the search points in the padding of my mittens, where it could not be felt. The warders found it on various occasions, but supposed that it was for praying and let me keep it. Until the end of my sentence, by which time I had accumulated 12,000 lines, and after that in my place of banishment, this necklace helped me to write and remember. I realized that I was not the only one, that I was party to a great secret, a secret maturing in other lonely breasts like mine on the scattered islands of the archipelago, to reveal itself in years to come, perhaps when they were dead, and to merge into the Russian literature of the future. How many of us were there? Many more, I think, than have come to the surface in the intervening years. Not all of them were to survive. Some buried manuscripts in bottles without telling anyone where. Some put their work in careless or, on the contrary, in excessively cautious hands for safekeeping. Some could not write their work down in time. Even on the Isle of Ekibistas, could we really get to know each other, encourage each other, support each other? Like wolves, we hid from everyone, and that meant from each other, too. Yet even so I was to discover a few others in Ekibistas. Meeting the religious poet Anatoly Vasilyevich Silin was a surprise which I owed to the Baptists. Day in and day out he was meek and gentle with everyone, but reserved. Only when we began talking to each other freely and strolling about the camp for hours at a stretch on our Sundays off, while he recited his very long religious poems to me, like me, he had written them right there in the camp. I was startled not for the first time or the last to realize what far from ordinary souls are concealed within deceptively ordinary exteriors. A homeless child, brought up an atheist in a children's home, he had come across some religious books in a German prisoner of war camp, and had been carried away by them. From then on he was not only a believer, but a philosopher and theologian. From then on, he had also been in prison or in camps without a break, and so had spent his whole theological career in isolation, rediscovering for himself things already discovered by others, perhaps going astray since he had never had either books or advisers. Now he was working as a manual laborer and ditch digger, struggling to fulfill an impossible norm, returning from work with bent knees and trembling hands. But night and day the poems, which he composed from end to end without writing a word down, in iambic tetrameters with an irregular rhyme scheme, went round and round in his head. He must have known some 20,000 lines by that time. He, too, had a utilitarian attitude to them. They were a way of remembering and of transmitting thoughts. His sensitive response to the riches of nature lent warmth and beauty to his view of the world. Bending over one of the rare blades of grass which grew illegally in our barren camp, he exclaimed, "How beautiful are the grasses of the earth! But even these the Creator has given to man for a carpet under his feet. How much more beautiful, then, must we be than they? But what about love not this world and the things that are of this world?" A saying which the sectarians often repeated. He smiled apologetically. He could disarm anyone with that smile. Why, even earthly, carnal love is a manifestation of a lofty aspiration to the union. His theodicy, that is to say, his justification of the existence of evil in the world, he formulated like this: Does God, who is perfect love, allow this imperfection in our lives? The soul must suffer first to know the perfect bliss of paradise. Harsh is the law, but to obey is for weak men the only way to win eternal peace. Christ's sufferings in the flesh he daringly explained not only by the need to atone for human sins, but also by God's desire to feel earthly suffering to the full. God always knew these sufferings, but never before had he felt them, Solzhenitsyn boldly asserted, even of the Antichrist who had corrupted man's free will, perverted his yearning toward the one true light. Solzhenitsyn found something fresh and humane to say. The bliss that God had given him, that angel haughtily rejected. He nothing knew of human pain. He loved not with the love of men. By grief alone is love perfected. Thinking so freely himself, Solzhenitsyn found a warm place in his generous heart for all shades of Christian belief. This is the crux, that through Christ's teaching is its theme. Genius must ever speak with its own voice. The atheist's impatient refusal to believe that spirit could beget matter only made Solzhenitsyn smile. Why don't they ask themselves how crude matter could beget spirit? That way round, it would surely be a miracle. Yes, a still greater miracle. My brain was full of my own verses, and these fragments are all that I have succeeded in preserving of the poems I heard from Solzhenitsyn, fearing perhaps that he himself would preserve nothing. A doomed and exhausted slave, with 4 number patches on his clothes, this poet had more in his heart to say to living human beings than the whole tribe of hacks, firmly established in journals, in publishing houses, in radio, and of no use to anyone except themselves. Solzhenitsyn ate from the same pot as the Baptists, shared his bread and warm victuals with them. Of course, he needed appreciative listeners, people with whom he could join in reading and interpreting the gospel, and in concealing the little book itself. But Orthodox Christians he either did not seek out, suspecting that they would reject him as a heretic, or did not find. The Baptists, however, seemed to respect Solzhenitsyn, listened to him. They even considered him one of their own, but they too disliked all that was heretical in him, and hoped in time to bend him to their ways. Solzhenitsyn was subdued when he talked to me in their presence, and blossomed out when they were not there. It was difficult for him to force himself into their mold, though their faith was firm, pure, and ardent, helping them to endure Katorga without wavering and without spiritual collapse. They were all honest, free from anger, hard-working, quick to help others, devoted to Christ. That is why they are being rooted out with such determination. In the years 1948 to 1950, several hundred of them were sentenced to 25 years' imprisonment and dispatched to special camps, for no other reason that they belonged to Baptist communes. A commune, of course, is an organization. The camp is different from the great outside. Outside, everyone uninhibitedly tries to express and emphasize his personality in his outward behavior. In prison, on the contrary, all are depersonalized. Identical haircuts, identical fuzz on their cheeks, identical caps, identical padded jackets. The face presents an image of the soul distorted by wind and sun and dirt and heavy toil. Discerning the light of the soul beneath this depersonalized and degraded exterior is an acquired skill. But the sparks of the spirit cannot be kept from spreading, breaking through to each other. Like recognizes and is gathered to like in a manner none can explain. End of Part 5, Chapter 5. Part 5, Chapter 6. The Committed Escaper. When Georgy Pavlovich Tenno talks nowadays about past escapees, his own, those of comrades, and those of which he knows only by repute, his words of praise for the most uncompromising and persistent heroes, Ivan Vorobyov, Mikhail Kadyrov, Grigory Kudla, Hafiz Hafizov, are these. There was a committed escaper. A committed escaper. One who never for a minute doubts that a man cannot live behind bars. Not even as the most comfortable of trustees, in the accounts office, in the culture and education section, or in charge of the bread ration. One who, once he lands in prison, spends every waking hour thinking about escape and dreams of escape at night. One who has vowed never to resign himself, and subordinates every action to his need to escape. one for whom a day in prison can never just be another day. There are only days of preparation for escape, days on the run, and days in the punishment cells after recapture and a beating. A committed escaper. This means one who knows what he is undertaking, one who has seen the bullet-riddled bodies of other escapers on the display along the central tract. He has also seen those brought back alive, like the man who was taken from hut to hut, black and blue and coughing blood, and made to shout, "Prisoners, look what happened to me. It can happen to you too." He knows that a runaway's body is usually too heavy to be delivered to camp, and that therefore the head alone is brought back in a duffel bag. Sometimes, this is more reliable proof according to the rulebook, together with the right arm chopped off at the elbow, so that the special section can check the fingerprints and write the man off. A committed escaper. It is for his benefit that the window bars are set in cement, that the camp area is encircled with dozens of strands of barbed wire, towers, fences, reinforced barriers, that ambushes and booby traps are set, that red meat is fed to gray dogs. The committed escaper is also one who refuses to be undermined by the reproaches of the average prisoner. You escapers make it worse for the rest. Discipline will be stiffer, 10 inspections a day, thinner gruel. He ignores the whispered suggestions of other prisoners, not only those who urge resignation. Life's not so bad even in a camp, especially if you get parcels. But those who want him to join in protests or hunger strikes, because all that is not struggle but self-deception. Of all possible means of struggle, he has eyes only for one, believes only in one, devotes himself only to one: escape. He cannot do otherwise. That is how he is made. A bird cannot renounce seasonal migration, and a committed escaper cannot help running away. In the intervals between unsuccessful attempts, peaceful prisoners would ask Tenno, "Why can't you just sit still? Why do you keep running? What do you expect to find on the outside, especially now?" Tenno was amazed. "What do you mean, what do I expect to find? Freedom, of course. A whole day in the taiga without chains. That's what I call freedom." That was Tenno for you. In each new camp, he was transferred frequently, he was depressed and miserable until his next escape plan matured. Once he had a plan, Tenno was radiant, and a smile of triumph never left his lips. There is no room in this book for his complicated life story, but the urge to escape had been with him from birth. As a small boy, he had run away from boarding school in Briansk to America, down the Desna in a rowboat. He had climbed the iron gates of the Piatigorsk's orphanage in his underwear in midwinter and run away to his grandmother. He was a very unusual amalgam of sailor and circus performer. He had gone through a school for seamen, served before the mast on an icebreaker, as a boatswain on a trawler, as navigation officer in the merchant navy. He had graduated from the Army's Institute of Foreign Languages, spent the war with the Northern Fleet, sailed to Iceland and England as liaison officer with British convoys. But he had also, from his childhood on, practiced acrobatics. He had appeared in circuses. He had trained gymnasts on the beam, performed as a memory man, memorizing masses of words and figures, and as a mind reader. The circus and living in seaports had led to some slight contact with the criminal world. He had picked up something of their language, their adventurousness, their quick-wittedness, their daredeviltry. Later on, serving time with thieves in the numerous disciplinary barracks, he had absorbed more and more from them. This, too, would come in handy for the committed escaper. A man is the product of his whole experience. That is how we come to be what we are. In 1948, he was suddenly demobilized. This was a signal from the other world. He knew languages, had sailed on an English vessel, and was, moreover, an Estonian, though it is true a Petersburg Estonian. But if we are to live, we must hope against hope. On Christmas Eve that year in Riga, where Christmas still feels like Christmas, like a holiday, He was arrested and taken to a cellar on the Amatu Street, next door to the conservatory. As he entered his first cell, he couldn't resist the temptation to tell the apathetically silent warder, "My wife and I had tickets for the Count of Monte Cristo and should be watching it right now. He fought for freedom, and I shall never accept defeat." But it was too early yet to start fighting. We are always at the mercy of our assumption that a mistake has been made. Prison? For what? It's impossible. They'll soon get it sorted out. Indeed, before his transfer to Moscow, they deliberately reassured him. This is done as a safety measure when prisoners are in transit. Colonel Morshinin, chief of counter-espionage, even came to the station to see him off and shook hands with him. "Have a good journey." There were 4 of them, Tenno and his special escort, and they traveled in a separate first-class compartment. The rhythm of the carriage wheels was soothing. We can fill their rattle with any meaning, any prophecy we please. It filled Tenno with hope that they would get it sorted out. And so he had no serious intention of running away. He was only sizing up the best way to do it. Later on he would often remember that night and cluck with annoyance. Never again would it be so easy to run. Never again would freedom be so near. The luxury of a special escort came to an end at the station in Moscow. The admission routine, sleepless nights, solitary confinement, more solitary confinement, a naive request to be called for interrogation soon. The warder yawned. "Don't be in such a hurry. You'll get more than you want shortly." At last, the interrogator. "Right, tell me about your criminal activities." "I'm absolutely innocent." Only Pope Pius is absolutely innocent. In his cell, he was tete-a-tete with a stool pigeon, trying to box him in. "Come on, tell me what really happened." A few interrogations, and it was all quite clear. They'd never straighten it out, never let him go. So he must escape. The world fame of the Lefortovo prison did not taunt Tenno. Perhaps he was like a soldier new to the front who had experienced nothing and therefore fears nothing. It was the interrogator, Anatoly Levshin, who inspired Tenno's escape plan, by turning mean and arousing his hatred. People and peoples have different criteria. So many millions had endured beatings within those walls, without even calling it torture. But for Tenno, the realization that he could be beaten with impunity was intolerable. It was an outrage, and he would sooner die than suffer it. So when Levshin, after verbal threats, first advanced on him and raised his fist, Tenno jumped up and answered with trembling fury, "Look, my life's worth nothing anyway, but I can gouge one or both of your eyes out right now. That much I can do." The interrogator retreated. One rotten prisoner's life in exchange for a good eye was not much of a bargain. Next he tried to wear Tenno down in the punishment cells, to sap his strength. Then he put on a show, pretending the woman screaming with pain in the next office was Tenno's wife, and that if he did not confess, she would undergo still worse tortures. Again, he had misjudged his man. If a blow from a fist was hard for Tenno to bear, the idea that his wife was being interrogated was no less so. It became increasingly obvious to the prisoner that the interrogator must be killed. This and his escape were combined in a single plan. Major Levshin, too, wore naval uniform, was tall and fair-haired. As far as the sentry on the interrogation block was concerned, Tenno could very easily pass for Levshin. True, Levshin's face was round and sleek, whereas Tenno had grown thin. In the meantime, they had removed the useless stoolie from the cell. His bed was left there, and Tenno examined it. A metal crosspiece was rusted through at the point where it was fixed to one of the legs. It was about 70 centimeters long. How could he break it off? First he must perfect his skill in counting seconds precisely. Then calculate for each warder the interval between 2 peeps through the spy hole. During one such interval he tried his strength, and the metal bar cracked off at the rusted end. Breaking the other solid end was harder. He would have to stand on it with both feet, but then it would crash onto the floor. So in the interval between 2 visits he must take time to put a pillow on the cement floor, stand on the bed frame, break it, replace the pillow, and hide the bar for the time being, say, in his bed. And all the time he must be counting seconds. It broke. The trick was done. But the problem was only half solved. If they came in and found it, he would be rotting in the punishment cells. 20 days of that, and he would lose the strength he needed to escape, or even to defend himself against the interrogator. Yes, that was it. He would tear the mattress with his fingernails, extract a little of the flock, wrap flock around the ends of the bar, and put it back where it had been. Counting the seconds, right, it was there. But this was still good only for a short time. Once every 10 days you went to the bathhouse, and while you were away, your cell was searched. They might discover the breakage, so he must act quickly. How was he to take the bar from the cell to the interrogation room? When they let you out of the cell block, there was no search. They only slapped your clothing when you came back from interrogation, and then only your sides and chest, where there were pockets. They were looking for a blade, to prevent suicide. Under his naval jacket, Tenno wore the traditional sailor's striped jersey. It warms the body and soul alike. The sailor leaves his troubles ashore. He asked a warder for a needle. They will give you one at certain fixed times, as if to sew on buttons made of bread. He undid his jacket, undid his trousers, pulled out the edge of his jersey, and turned it up and stitched it so that it formed a little pocket for the lower end of the rod. He had previously snapped off a bit of tape from his underpants. Now he pretended to be sewing a button on his jacket and stitched this tape to the inside of his jersey at chest level, so that it formed a loop to hold the rod steady. Next, he put the jersey on back to front, and began practicing day after day. The rod was set in position down his back and under his jersey. It was pushed through the loop at the top until it rested in the pocket down below. The upper end of the rod came up to his neck, under his tunic collar. His training routine went like this. In the short time between 2 inspections, he would have to fling his hand to the back of his neck, seize the end of the rod while bending his trunk backward, then with a reverse movement straighten like a released bowstring while simultaneously drawing the rod, and strike the investigating officer a smart blow on the head. Then he would put everything back in place. He also provided himself with 2 wads of flock from the same mattress. These he could insert between his gums and his cheeks to make his face fuller. He must also, of course, be clean-shaven on the day, and they scraped you with blunt razors only once a week, so that the day must be chosen carefully. How was he to put some color into his cheeks? He would rub just a little blood on them. That fellow's blood. Mustn't forget anything important, and must pack it all into 4 or 5 minutes. When he's lying there knocked out, I must. 1. Slip off my jacket and put on his newer one with shoulder tabs. 2. Remove his shoelaces and lace my own floppy shoes up. That will take time. 3. Tuck his razor blade into a specially prepared place in the heel of my shoe. If they catch me and sling me into the nearest cell, I can cut my veins. 4. Examine all his documents and take what I need. 5. Memorize the license plate number and find the ignition key. 6. Shove my own dossier into his bulky briefcase and take it with me. 7. Remove his watch. 8. Redden my cheeks with blood. 9. Drag his body behind the desk or screen, so that anybody coming in will think he's left and not raise a hue and cry. 10. Roll the flock into little balls and put them in my cheeks. 11. Put on his coat and cap. 12. Disconnect the wires to the light switch. If anybody comes soon afterward, finds it dark and tries the switch, he will be sure to think the bulb has burnt out, and that's why the interrogator has gone to another office. Even if they screw another bulb in, they won't immediately realize what has happened. That makes 12 things to be done, and the escape itself will be number 13. Of course, the odds were against him. For the moment, he gave himself a 3 to 5% chance of success. The outer guard room was completely unknown and had no real hope of getting past it. but he couldn't die here like a slave. So Tenno turned up, freshly shaven, for one nocturnal interrogation, with the iron bar behind his back. The interrogator questioned, abused, threatened, and all the time Tenno looked at him in surprise. Couldn't he sense that his hours were numbered? Tenno's heart thumped. A day of rejoicing was at hand, or perhaps his last day. Things turned out quite differently. Around midnight, another interrogator hurried into the room and began whispering into Levshin's ear. This had never happened before. Levshin made hurried preparations to leave, pressed the button for the warder to come and remove the prisoner. That was that. Tenno went back to his cell and replaced the iron bar. Then came a daytime interrogation, and it took a strange turn. The interrogator refrained from yelling, and weakened his resolve by predicting that he would get 5 to 7 years, so that there was no need to be downhearted. Somehow Tenno no longer felt angry enough to split his head open. Tenno's wrath was not the sort that lasted. The mood of excitement had passed. It seemed to him now that the odds were too great, that it was too much of a gamble. The escaper's moods are perhaps even more capricious than those of the artist. All his lengthy preparations had gone for nothing. But the escaper must be ready for this, too. He had brandished his bar in the air 100 times, killed 100 interrogators. A dozen times he had lived through every minute of his escape in detail. In the office, past the square window, along to the guard room, beyond the guard room. He had worn himself out with an escape which he would not, after all, be making. Soon afterward they changed his interrogator and transferred him to the Libyanka. There Tenno did not actively prepare to escape. His heart was not in it now that his interrogation seemed to have taken a more hopeful turn. Vague hopes of clemency and reasonableness clouded Tenno's resolution. Only in the Butyrki prison was he relieved of this burden. His sentence, read out from a piece of paper with a special board stamp, was confinement in camps for 25 years. He signed his name and felt relieved, found himself smiling, felt his legs carrying him easily to the cell for 25-year prisoners. That sentence released him from humiliation, from the temptation to compromise, from humble submission, from truckling, from promises of 5 to 7 years bestowed like alms on a beggar. 25 is it, you bastards? Right, if that's all we can expect from you, we escape. Other people in the cell might talk about what they liked, but Tenno wanted stories about escape attempts and those who took part in them. From the Kubyshev transit prison they were taking prisoners to the station in open trucks, making up a long train of red prison cars. In the transit prison, Tenno obtained from a local sneak thief who respected escapers 2 local addresses to which he might go for initial support. He shared these addresses with 2 other would-be runaways, and they concerted a plan. All 3 would try to sit in the back row, and when the truck slowed down at a turning, they would jump. All 3 of them at once, right, left, and rear, past the guards, knocking them over if necessary. The guards would open fire, but they would not hit all 3. They might not shoot at all. There would be people in the streets. Would they give chase? No, they couldn't abandon the other prisoners in the truck, so they would just shout and fire into the air. If the runaways were stopped, it would be by ordinary people, our Soviet people, passers-by. To frighten them off, the runaways must pretend to be holding knives. They had no knives. The 3 of them maneuvered at the search point and hung back so that they would get onto the last truck and not leave before dusk. The last truck arrived, but it was not a shallow 3-tonner like its predecessors, but a Studebaker with high sides. When he sat down, even Tenno found that the top of his head was below the rim. The Studebaker moved quickly. Here was the turn. Tenno looked around at his comrades in arms. There was terror on their faces. No, they wouldn't jump. No, they were not committed escapers. But can you be sure of yourself? He wondered. In the dark, with lanterns to light their way, to a confused accompaniment of barking, yelling, cursing, clanking, they were installed in cattle cars. Here Tenno let himself down. He was too slow to inspect the outside of the car. and your committed escaper must see everything while the scene is good. He is not allowed to miss anything at all. At stops, the guards anxiously sounded the cars with mallets. They sounded every single plank. They were afraid of something then, but of what? Afraid that a plank might be sawn through. So that was the thing to do. A small piece broken off a hacksaw and sharpened was produced by the thieves. They decided to cut through a solid plank under the bottom bed shelf. Then, when the train slowed down, to lower themselves through the gap, drop onto the line, and lie still until the cars had passed over them. True, the experts said that at the end of a cattle train carrying prisoners there was usually a drag, a metal scraper with teeth which passed close to the ties, caught the body of anyone trying to escape, and dragged them over the ties to his death. All night long they took turns slipping under the bed shelf, sawing away at a plank in the wall, gripping the blade, which was only a few centimeters long, with a piece of a rag. It was hard going. Nonetheless, the first breach was made. The plank began to give a little. Loosening it, they saw in what was now in the morning light white unplaned boards outside their car. Why white? The reason was that an additional footboard for guards had been built onto their car. Right there, by the breach they had made, stood a sentry. It was impossible to go on sawing till the board came away. Prison escapes, like all forms of human activity, have their own history and their own theory. It's as well to know about them before you try your own hand. The history is that of previous escapes. You can learn the history from others who once escaped and were recaptured. Their experience has been dearly bought, with blood, with suffering, almost at the cost of their lives. But to inquire in detail, step by step, about the attempts of one escaper, then a third, then a fifth, is no laughing matter. It can be very dangerous. It is not much less dangerous than asking whether anyone knows whom you should see about joining an underground organization. Still, as he moved from prison to prison, camp to camp, Tenno eagerly interrogated escapers. He carried out escapes himself. He was caught. He had other escapers for cellmates in the camp jails, and this was his chance to question them. As for the theory of escape, it is very simple. You do it any way you can. If you can get away, that shows you know your theory. If you're caught, you haven't yet mastered it. The elementary principles are as follows. You can escape from a work site, or you can escape from the living area. It is easier from work sites. There are many of them. The security measures are less rigid, and the escaper has tools to hand. You can run alone. It is more difficult, but no one will betray you. Or you can run away in a group, which is easier, but then everything depends on whether you are a well-matched team. Theory further prescribes that you should know the geography as well as if you had an illuminated map in front of you, but you will never catch sight of a map in the camp. A further precept, you must know the people through whose region your escape route lies. Then there is the following general advice as to method. You must constantly prepare to escape according to plan, but be ready at any minute to do it quite differently, to seize a chance. Tenno's first camp was Novorudnoy, near Jezkazgan. Now you are in the very place where they have doomed you to die. This is the place of all places from which you must escape. All around there is desert, salt flats and dunes, or firmer ground held together by tufted grass or prickly camel weed. In some parts of the plains, Kazakhs roam with their herds. In others, there is not a soul. There are no rivers, and you are very unlikely to come upon a well. The best time for flight is April or May, while melting snow still lingers here and there in puddles. But the camp guards are very well aware of this. At this time of year, the search of prisoners going out to work becomes stricter, and they are not allowed to take with them a single bite or a single rag more than necessary. During his time there, Tenno had got to know a lot of people in the camp, and he now quickly assembled a team of 4. Misha Kerderov, he had been with the Marines in North Korea, had crossed the 38th parallel to avoid a court-martial. Not wishing to spoil the good relations firmly established in Korea, the Americans had handed him back and he had got a quarter. Jadzik, a Polish driver from the Anders army, He vividly summarized his life story with the help of his unmatching boots, one from Hitler, one from Stalin. And lastly, Sergei, a railway man from Kubyshev. Then a lorry arrived with reel posts and rolls of barbed wire for a boundary fence, just as the dinner break was beginning. Tenno's team, loving forced labor as they did, especially when it was to make their prison more secure, volunteered to unload the lorry in the rest period. They scrambled onto the back, but since it was, after all, dinner time, they took their time while they thought things over. The driver had moved away from his vehicle. The prisoners were lying all over the place, basking in the sun. Should they run for it or not? They had nothing ready, no knife, no equipment, no food, no plan. But Tenno knew from his little map that if they were driving, they must make a dash for Jezady and then to Uluto. The lads were eager to try it. This was their chance, their lucky chance. From where they were to the sentry at the gate, the way was downhill. Just beyond the gate, the road rounded a hill. If they drove out fast, they'd soon be safe from marksmen, and the sentries could not leave their posts. They finished unloading before the break was over. Jazdik was to drive. He jumped off and puttered around the lorry while the other three lazily lay down in the rear, out of sight, hoping that some of the sentries hadn't seen where they had got to. Jazdik brought the driver over. "We haven't kept you waiting, so let's have a smoke." They lit up. "Right, wind her up." The driver got into the cab, but the engine obstinately refused to start. The three in the back of the lorry didn't know Jazdik's plan and thought their attempt had misfired. Jazdik began turning the crank. Still the engine would not start. Jazdik was tired, and he suggested to the driver that they change places. Now Jazdik was in the cab, and the engine immediately let out a roar. The lorry rolled down the slope toward the sentry at the gate. Jazdik told them later that he had tampered with the throttle while the driver was at the wheel, and quickly turned it on again before he himself took over. The driver was in no hurry to jump in. He thought that Jazdik would stop the lorry. Instead, it passed through the gate at speed. 2 shouts of "Halt!" The lorry went on. Sentries opened fire, shooting into the air at first because it looked very much like a mistake. Perhaps some shots were aimed at the lorry. The runaways couldn't tell. They were lying flat. Around a bend, once behind the hill, they were safe from bullets. The three in the back kept their heads down. It was bumpy. They were traveling fast. Then suddenly they came to a stop, and Jazdik cried out in despair. He had taken the wrong turn, and they were pulled up short by the gates of a mine, with its own camp area and its watchtowers. More shooting. Guards ran toward them. The escapers tumbled out onto the ground face downward and covered their heads with their hands. Convoy guards kick, aiming particularly at the head, the ears, the temples, and, from above, at the spine. The wholesome universal rule, "Don't kick a man when he's down," did not apply in Stalin's Katorga. If a man was down, that's just what they did. Kicked him. And if he was on his feet, they shot him. But the inquiry revealed that there had been no breakout. Yes, the lads said in unison that they had been dozing in the back when the lorry started moving. And then there was shooting, and it was too late for them to jump off in case they were shot. And Jazdik, he was inexperienced, couldn't handle the lorry. But he'd steered for the mine next door, not for the steppe. So they got off with a beating. On May 9th, 1950, the 5th anniversary of victory in the Fatherland War, naval veteran Georgy Tenno entered a cell in the celebrated Kengir prison. It was a select company in the Kengir jail, brought together from various camps. In every cell there were experienced escapers, hand-picked champions. Tenno had found his committed escapers at last. They were destined never to remain long in one place. The committed escapers, like Flying Dutchmen, were driven ever onward by their troubled destiny. If they didn't run away, they were transferred. This whole band of men in a hurry was switched, in handcuffs, to Ekebusta's camp jail. In something like a month there had been 3 attempts to escape from Ekebusta's, and still Tenno was not on the run. He was pining away. A jealous longing to outdo them gnawed at him. From the sidelines, you see all the mistakes more clearly and always think that you could do better. Janak was small, swarthy, very agile. When he caught fire, he was very energetic. He put everything he had into his work, into an impulse, a fight, or an escape. Of course, he lacked discipline, but Tenno had plenty of that. Everything pointed to the lime kilns as the best place for their escape. One day at the lime kilns, they damaged the electric cable of a cement mixer. An electrician was called in from outside. When Tenno helped him with his repairs, Zanuck stole some wire cutters from his pocket. While they were at the lime kilns, the would-be escapers made themselves 2 knives. They chiseled strips of metal from shovels, sharpened them at their blacksmith's shop, tempered them, and cast tin handles for them in clay molds. Tenno's was a Turkish knife. It would be a handy weapon to use, and what was more important, the flashing curve of the blade was terrifying. Their intention was to frighten people, not kill them. Wire cutters and knives they carried to the living area held to their ankles by the legs of their underpants, and stowed them away in the foundations of the hut. Their escape plan hinged on the culture and education section. While the weapons were being made and transferred, Tenno chose a suitable moment to announce that he and Zanuck would like to take part in a camp concert. Sure enough, Tenno and Zanuck were given permission to leave the punishment wing after it was locked for the night, and while the camp area as a whole was still alive and in motion for another 2 hours. They roamed the still unknown camp, noting how and when the guard was changed on the watchtowers, and which were the most convenient spots to crawl under the boundary fence. In the culture and education section itself, Tenno carefully read the Pavlodar provincial newspaper, trying to memorize the names of districts, state farms, collective farms, farm chairmen, party secretaries, shock workers of all kinds. Next, he announced that he would put on a sketch, for which he must get a hold of his ordinary clothes from the clothing store and borrow a briefcase. A runaway with a briefcase, that was something out of the ordinary. It would help him look important. Permission was given. The sketch required so much rehearsing that the time left till lights out in the main camp area was too short, so there was one night, and later on another, when Tenno and Zanuck did not return to the punishment wing at all, but spent the night in the hut which housed the culture and education section, to accustom their own warders to their absence. Escapers must have at least 1 night's head start. What would be the most propitious moment to escape? Evening roll call. When the lines formed outside the huts, the warders were all busy checking in prisoners, while the prisoners had eyes only for the doors, longing to get to their beds. No one was watching the rest of the camp area. The days were getting shorter, and they must hit on one when the roll call would come after sundown, in the twilight, but before the dogs were stationed around the boundary fence. They must not let slip those 5 or 10 uniquely precious minutes, because there would be no crawling out once the dogs were there. They chose Sunday, September 17th. It would help that Sunday was a non-working day, so that they could recruit their strength by evening, and take time over the final preparations. The last night before escape. You can't expect much sleep. You think and think. Shall I be alive this time tomorrow? Possibly not. And if I stay here in camp? To die the lingering death of a goner by a cesspit? No, you mustn't even begin to accept the idea that you are a prisoner. The question is this: are you prepared to die? You are? Then you are also prepared to escape. A sunny Sunday. To rehearse their sketch, both of them were let out of the punishment wing for the whole day. The runaways were very short of food. In the punishment wing they were short on rations, and hoarding bread would excite suspicion. They banked on seizing a lorry in the settlement and traveling quickly. However, that Sunday there was also a parcel from home, his mother's blessing on his escape. Glucose tablets, macaroni oatmeal. These they could carry in the briefcase. They must also get a hold of a katyusha, an improvised lighter consisting of a wick in a tube, and a steel and flint to light it. This was better than matches for a man on the run. Sunday was coming to an end. A golden sun was setting. Tenno, tall and leisurely, and Zanuck, small and vivacious, now draped padded jackets around their shoulders, took the briefcase. By now everyone in the camp was used to their eccentric appearance, and went to the prearranged departure point. on the grass between some huts, not far from the boundary fence and directly opposite a watchtower. The huts screened them from 2 other watchtowers. There was only this one sentry facing them. They opened out their padded jackets, lay down on them, and played chess, so that the sentry would get used to them. The sky turned gray. There was the signal for roll call. The prisoners flocked to their huts. In the half-light, the sentry on his watchtower should not be able to make out that 2 men were still lying on the grass. His watch was nearly over, and he was less alert than he had been. A stale sentry always makes escape easier. They intended to cut the wire, not in the open, but directly under the tower. The sentry certainly spent more time watching the boundary fence farther away than the ground under his feet. Their heads were down near the grass, and besides, it was dusk, so they could not see the spot at which they would shortly crawl under. But it had been thoroughly inspected in advance. Immediately beyond the boundary fence a hole had been dug for a post, and it would be possible to hide there a minute. A little farther on there were mounds of slag, and a road running from the guards' hamlet to the settlement. The plan was to take a lorry as soon as they reached the settlement, stop one and say to the driver, "Do you want to earn something? We have to bring 2 cases of vodka up from old Ekibistas." What driver would refuse drink? They would bargain with him. "Half a liter all right? A liter? Right, step on it, but not a word to anybody." Then on the highway, sitting with the driver in his cab, they would overpower him, drive him out to the step, and leave him there tied up, while they tore off to reach the Irtish in a single night, abandon the lorry, cross the river in a little boat, and move on toward Omsk. It got a little darker still. Up the towers, searchlights were switched on. Their beams lit up the boundary fence, but the runaways for the time being were in a shadowy patch. The very time. Soon the watch would be changed and the dogs would be brought along and posted for the night. Now the lights were switched on in the huts, and they could see the prisoners going in after roll call. Was it nice inside? It would be warm, comfortable. Whereas here you could be riddled with Tommy gun bullets, and it would be all the more humiliating because you were lying stretched on the ground. Just so long as they didn't cough or sneeze under the tower. Guard away, you guard dogs. Your job is to keep us here. Ours is to run away. End of Part 5, Chapter 6. Part 5, Chapter 7. The White Kitten. Georgi Tenno's Tale. In this chapter, Georgi Tenno picks up from where the preceding chapter left off and tells his own story. Exercising great daring, he and Kolya Zhanak remained on the loose for the better part of a month, scrounging for food and water and sometimes stealing. Eventually they were captured and given long sentences. After his release from camp, Tenno died of cancer. End of Part 5, Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Escapes, Morale and Mechanics. Escapes from corrective labor camps, provided they were not to somewhere like Vienna or across the Bering Strait, were apparently viewed by Gulag's rulers and by Gulag's regulations with resignation. They saw them as only natural, a manifestation of the waste which is unavoidable in any overextended economic enterprise, a phenomenon of the same sort as cattle losses from disease or starvation, the logs that sink instead of floating, the gap in a wall where a half-brick was used instead of a whole one. It was different in the special camps. In accordance with the particular wish of the Father of the Peoples, these camps were equipped with greatly reinforced defenses and with greatly reinforced armament at the modern motorized infantry level. At the moment of their foundation, it was laid down in the instructions for the special camps that there could be no escape from them, because if one of these prisoners escaped, it was just as though a major spy had crossed the frontier and a blot on the political record of the camp administration and of the officers commanding the convoy troops. But from that very moment, 58s to a man started getting, not tenors as before, but quarters, i.e., the limit allowed by the criminal code. This senseless across-the-board increase in severity carried with it one disadvantage. Just as murderers were undeterred from fresh murders, each time their tenor was merely slightly updated, so now political prisoners were no longer deterred by the criminal code from trying to escape. And although there were fewer escapes from the special camps than from the corrective labor camps, they were rougher, grimmer, more ruthless, more desperate, and therefore more glorious. Stories about them can help us to make up our minds whether our people really was so long-suffering, really was so humbly submissive in those years. Here is just one of them. In September 1949, 2 convicts escaped from the 1st Division of Steplag, Rudnik, Jezkazgan. Grigory Kudla, a tough, steady, level-headed old man, a Ukrainian, but when his dander was up he had the temper of a Zaporozhian Cossack, and even the hardened criminals were afraid of him. And Ivan Jusheshkin, a quiet Belarusian some 35 years old. In the pit where they worked they found a prospecting shaft in an old workings with a grating at its upper end. When they were on night shift they gradually loosened this grating, and at the same time they took into the shaft dried crusts, knives, and a hot water bottle stolen from the medical section. On the night of their escape attempt, once down in the pit, each of them separately informed the foreman that he felt unwell, couldn't work, and would lie down a bit. At night there were no warders underground. The foreman was the sole representative of authority, and he had to bully discreetly, or else he might be found with his head smashed in. The escapers filled the hot water bottle, took their provisions, and went into the prospecting shaft. They forced the grating and crawled out. The exit turned out to be near the watchtowers, but outside the camp boundary. They walked off unnoticed. They lay down in the daytime and walked at night. Not once did they come across water, and after a week Dusheshkin no longer felt like standing up. Kudla got him on his feet with the hope that there might be water in the hills ahead. They dragged themselves that far, but the hollows held no water, only mud. Then Dusheshkin said, "I can't go on anyway. Cut my throat and drink my blood." You moralists! What was the right thing to do? Kudla, too, could no longer see straight. Dusheshkin was going to die. Why should Kudla perish, too? But if he found water soon afterward, how could he live with the thought of Dusheshkin for the rest of his days? "I'll go on a bit," Kudla decided, "and if in the morning I come back without water, I'll put him out of his misery, and we needn't both perish." Kudla staggered to a hillock, saw a cleft in it, and just as in the most improbable of novels, in the cleft there was water. Kudla slithered to it, fell flat on his face, and drank and drank. Only in the morning he had eyes for the tadpoles and waterweed in it. He went back to Dusheshkin with the hot water bottle full. "I've brought you some water. Yes, water." Dusheshkin couldn't believe it, drank, and still didn't believe it. For hours he had been imagining that he was drinking. They dragged themselves as far as the cleft and stayed there, drinking. When they had drunk, hunger set in, but the following night they climbed over a ridge and went down into a valley like the promised land, with a dark river, grass, bushes, horses, life. When it got dark, Kudla crept up to the horses and killed one of them. They drank its blood straight from the wounds. Partisans of peace, that very year you were loudly in session in Vienna or Stockholm, and sipping cocktails through straws. Did it occur to you that compatriots of the versifier Tikhonov and the journalist Ehrenberg were sucking the blood out of dead horses? Did they explain to you in their speeches that that was the meaning of peace, Soviet style? They roasted the horses' flesh on fires, ate lengthily, and walked on. Farther on, they frequently came across streams and pools. Kudla also caught and killed a ram. By now, they had been a month on the run. October was nearing its end. It was getting cold. In the first wood, they reached up and found a dugout and set up house in it. They couldn't bring themselves to leave this land of plenty. That their native places did not call to them or promise them a more peaceful life meant that their escape lacked a goal and was doomed to fail. At night they would raid the village nearby, filch a pot or break into a pantry for flour, salt, an axe, some crockery. Inevitably, the escaper, like the partisan, soon becomes a thief, preying on the peaceful folk all around him. Another time they took a cow from the village and slaughtered it in the forest. But then when the first snow came, and to avoid leaving tracks, they had to sit tight in their dugout. Kudla went out just once for brushwood, and the forester immediately opened fire on him. "So you're the thieves, are you? You're the ones who stole the cow." Sure enough, traces of blood were found around the dugout. They were taken to the village and locked up. People shouted that they should be shot out of hand and no mercy shown to them. But an investigating officer arrived from the district center with a picture sent around to assist the nationwide search, and addressed the villagers. "Well done," he said. "These aren't thieves you've caught, but dangerous political criminals." Suddenly there was a complete change of attitude. The owner of the cow, a Chechen as it turned out, bought the prisoners bread, mutton, and even some money collected by the Chechens. "What a pity," he said. "You should have come and told me who you were, and I'd have given you everything you wanted." There is no reason to doubt it. That's how Chechens are. Kudla burst into tears. After so many years of savagery, he couldn't stand sympathy. The prisoners were removed to Kustanai and put in the railroad jail, where their captors not only took away the Chechens' offering and pocketed it, but gave them no food at all. Didn't Kornichuk tell you about it at the peace conference? Before they were put on the train out of Kustanai, they were made to kneel on the station platform with their hands handcuffed behind their backs. They were kept like that for some time, for the whole world to see. If it had been on a station platform in Moscow, Leningrad, or Kiev, or any other flourishing city, everybody would have passed by. The people of Kustanai, however, had little to lose. They were all either sworn enemies, or persons with black marks against them, or simply exiles. They started crowding around the prisoners and tossing them makorka, cigarettes, bread. Kudla's wrists were shackled behind his back, so he bent over to pick up a piece of bread with his teeth, but the guard kicked it out of his mouth. Kudla rolled over and again groveled to pick it up, and the guard kicked the bread farther away. You progressive filmmakers, perhaps you will remember this scene and this old man. The people began pressing forward and making noise. "Let them go! Let them go!" A militia squad appeared. The policemen had the advantage and dispersed the people. The train pulled in, and the prisoners were loaded for transport to the Kengir jail. End of Part 5, Chapter 8. Part 5, Chapter 9. The Kids with Tommy Guns. The camps were guarded by men in great coats with black cuffs. They were guarded by Red Army men. They were guarded by prisoner guards. They were guarded by elderly reservists. Last came the robust youngsters born during the first 5-year plan, who had seen no war service when they took their nice new Tommy guns and set about guarding us. Twice every day, for an hour at a time, we and they shuffled along, tied together in silent and deadly brotherhood. Any one of them was at liberty to kill any one of us. We walked with never a glance at their sheepskin coats and their Tommy guns. What were they to us? They walked watching our dark ranks all the time. It was there in the regulations that they must watch us all the time. Orders were orders. Duty was duty. Any wrong movement, any false step, they must cut short with a bullet. How did they think of us in our dark jackets, our gray caps of Stalin fur, our grotesque felt boots that had served 3 sentences and shed 4 souls, our crazy quilt of number patches? Decent people would obviously never be treated like that. Was it surprising that our appearance inspired disgust? It was intended to do just that. These kids were not allowed to know anything about us. They were allowed only the right to shoot without warning. If they had just visited us in our huts of an evening, sat on our bunks and heard why this old man, or the old fellow over there, was inside, Those towers would have been unmanned, and those Tommy guns would never have been fired. But the whole cunning and strength of the system was in the fact that our deadly bond was forged from ignorance. Any sympathy they showed for us was punishable as treason. Any wish to speak to us as a breach of a solemn oath. And what was the point of talking to us when the political instructor would come at fixed intervals to lead a discussion on the political and moral character of the enemies of the people whom they were guarding? The political instructor will never contradict himself, never make a slip. He will never tell the boys that some people are imprisoned here simply for believing in God, or simply for desiring truth, or simply for love of justice, or indeed for nothing at all. Here is one such political lesson, as remembered by a former convoy guard at Neroblag. Lieutenant Samutin was a lanky, narrow-shouldered man, and his head was flat above the temples. He looked like a snake. He was tow-headed and almost without eyebrows. We knew that in the past he had shot people with his own hands. Now he was a political instructor, reciting in a monotonous voice, "The enemies of the people, over whom you stand guard, are the same as the fascists, filthy scum. We embody the power and the punitive sword of the motherland, and we must be firm. No sentimentality, no pity." This is how they mold the boys who make a point of kicking a runaway's head when he is down. The boys who can boot a piece of bread out of the mouth of a gray-haired old man in handcuffs, who can look with indifference at a shackled runaway jounced on the splintery boards of a lorry. His face is bloodied, his head is battered, but they look on unmoved, for they are the motherland's punitive sword, and he, so they say, is an American colonel. After Stalin's death, then living in internal banishment, I was a patient in an ordinary free Tashkent clinic. Suddenly I heard a patient, a young Uzbek, telling his neighbors about his service in the army. His unit had, he said, kept guard on beasts and butchers. It enraged them that they, the convoy guards, had to freeze on top of watchtowers in the winter, in sheepskin coats down to their heels, it's true, while the enemies of the people, once they entered the working area, scattered about the warming-up shacks. Even from the watchtower he could have seen that it was not so, and slept there all day. Here was an interesting opportunity, to look at a special camp through the eyes of a convoy guard. I began asking what kind of reptiles they were and whether my Uzbek friend had talked to them personally, and of course he told me that he had learned all this from political officers, that they had even had cases read out to them in their political indoctrination sessions, and his malicious misconceptions about prisoners sleeping all day had, of course, been reinforced in him by the approving nods of officers. Woe unto you that caused these little ones to stumble. Better for you had you never been born. He told us of a number of incidents. Once, for instance, one of his comrades was marching in convoy and fancied that somebody was about to run out of the column. He pressed his trigger and killed 5 prisoners with a single burst. Since all the other guards later testified that the column had been moving quietly along, this soldier incurred a terrible punishment. For killing 5 people, he was put in detention for 15 days. In a warm guardhouse, of course. But which of the archipelago's inhabitants has no stories of this sort to tell? We knew so many of them in the corrective labor camps. On a work site which has no fence but an invisible boundary line, a shot rang out and a prisoner fell. Why? Because the man has a gun. Because one man has the arbitrary power to kill or not to kill another. What's more, it pays. The bosses are always on your side. They'll never punish you for killing somebody. On the contrary, they'll commend you, reward you, and the quicker you are on the trigger, bring him down when he's only put half a foot wrong, the more vigilant you are seen to be, the higher the reward. A month's pay, a month's leave. Yes, but their underlying common humanity must have been weak, or altogether lacking, if it was not proof against an oath and a few political discussion periods. Not every generation, and not every people, is of the stuff from which such boys are fashioned. This is surely the main problem of the 20th century. Is it permissible merely to carry out orders and commit one's conscience to someone else's keeping? Can a man do without ideas of his own about good and evil, and merely derive them from the printed instructions and verbal orders of his superiors? Oaths. Those solemn pledges pronounced with a tremor in the voice and intended to defend the people against evildoers. See how easily they can be misdirected to the service of evildoers and against the people. End of Part 5, Chapter 9. Part 5, Chapter 10. Behind the wire, the ground is burning. No, the surprising thing is not that mutinies and risings did not occur in the camps, but that in spite of everything, they did. Like all embarrassing events in our history, which means 3/4 of what really happened, these mutinies have been neatly cut out, and the gap hidden with an invisible join. Those who took part in them have been destroyed, and even remote witnesses frightened into silence. The reports of those who suppressed them have been burned or hidden in safes within safes within safes, so that the risings have already become a myth, although some of them happened only 15 and others only 10 years ago. No wonder some say that there was no Christ, no Buddha, no Muhammad. There you're dealing in thousands of years. When it can no longer disturb any living person, historians will be given access to what is left of the documents. Archaeologists will do a little digging, heat something in a laboratory, and the dates, locations, contours of these risings, with the names of their leaders, will come to light. Perhaps we, no, not we ourselves, shall learn at the same time about the legendary rising in 1948 at Public Works Site number 501, where the Sevilla-Masca-Salicards Railway was under construction. It was legendary because everybody in the camps talked about it in whispers, but no one really knew anything. Legendary also because it broke out not in the special camp system, where the mood and the grounds for it by now existed, but in a corrective labor camp, where people were isolated from each other by fear of informers and trampled underfoot by thieves, where even their right to be politicals was spat upon, and where a prison mutiny therefore seemed inconceivable. According to the rumors, it was all the work of ex-soldiers, recent ex-soldiers. It could not have been otherwise. Without them, the 58s lacked stamina, spirit, and leadership. But these young men, hardly any of them over 30, were officers and enlisted men from our fighting armies, or their fellows who had been prisoners of war. These young men still retained in 1948 their wartime elan and believed in themselves, and they could not accept the idea that men like themselves, whole battalions of them, should meekly die. Even escape seemed to them a contemptible half-measure, rather like deserting one by one instead of facing the enemy together. It was all planned and begun in one particular team. An ex-colonel called Voronin or Voronov, a one-eyed man, is said to have been the leader. A first lieutenant of armored troops, Sakharenko, is also mentioned. The team killed their convoy guards. Then they went and freed a second team, and a third. They attacked the convoy guards' hamlet, then the camp from outside, removed the sentries from the towers, and opened up the camp area. Arming themselves with weapons taken from the guards, the rebels went on to capture the neighboring camp division. With their combined forces, they decided to advance on Vorkuta. It was only 60 kilometers away, but this was not to be. Parachute troops were dropped in to bar their way. Then low-flying fighter planes raked them with machine gun fire and dispersed them. They were tried, more of them were shot, and others given 25 or 10 years. At the same time, many of those who had not joined in the operation but remained in the camp had their sentences refreshed. The hopelessness of this rising as a military operation is obvious, but would you say that dying quietly by inches was more hopeful? Riddle. What is the quickest thing in the world? Answer. Thought. It is and it isn't. It can be slow, too. Oh, how slow. Only slowly and laboriously do men, people, society, realize what has happened to them, realize the truth about their position. In herding the 58s into special camps, Stalin was exerting his strength mainly for his own amusement. He had already had them as securely confined as they could be, but he thought he would be craftier than ever and improve on his best. He thought he knew how to make it still more frightening. The results were quite the opposite. The whole system of oppression elaborated in his reign was based on keeping malcontents apart, preventing them from reading each other's eyes, and discovering how many of them there were, instilling it into all of them, even into the most dissatisfied, that no one was dissatisfied except a few doomed individuals, blindly vicious and spiritually bankrupt. In the special camps, however, there were malcontents by the thousands. They knew their numerical strength, and they realized that they were not spiritual paupers, that they had a nobler conception of what life should be than their jailers, than their betrayers, than the theorists who try to explain why they must rot in camps. The old camp mentality, you die first, I'll wait a bit, there is no justice, so forget it, that's the way it was and that's the way it will be, also began to disappear. A bold thought, a desperate thought, a thought to raise a man up. How could things be changed so that instead of us running from them, they would run from us? Once the question was put, once a certain number of people had thought of it and put it into words, and a certain number had listened to them, the age of escapes was over. The age of rebellion had begun. Suddenly, a suicide. In the disciplinary barracks, hut number 2, a man was found hanging. I am going through the stages of the process as they occurred in Abridged. But note that the stages were just the same in other special camps. The bosses were not greatly upset. They cut him down and wheeled him off to the scrap heap. A rumor went around the work team. The man was an informer. He hadn't hanged himself. He had been hanged. A lesson to the rest. Kill the stoolie. That was it. The vital link. A knife in the heart of the stoolie. Make knives and cut stoolies' throats. That was it. Now, as I write this chapter, rows of humane books frown down at me from the walls, the tarnished gilt on their well-worn spines glinting reproachfully like stars through cloud. Nothing in the world should be sought through violence. By taking up the sword, the knife, the rifle, we quickly put ourselves on the level of our tormentors and persecutors, and there will be no end to it. There will be no end. Here at my warm desk, in a warm place, I agree completely. If you ever get 25 years for nothing, if you find yourself wearing 4 number patches on your clothes, holding your hands permanently behind your back, submitting to searches morning and evening, working until you are utterly exhausted, dragged into the cooler when someone denounces you, trodden deeper and deeper into the ground, from the hole you're in, the fine words of the great humanists will sound like chatter of the well-fed and free. The oppressed, at least, concluded that evil cannot be cast out by good. Murders now followed one another in quicker succession than escapes in the best period. They were carried out confidently and anonymously. No one went in with a blood-stained knife to give himself up. They saved themselves and their knives for another deed. At their favorite time, when a single warder was unlocking huts one after another, and while nearly all the prisoners were still sleeping, the masked avengers entered a particular section, went up to a particular bunk, and unhesitatingly killed the traitor, who might be awake and howling in terror, or might be still asleep. When they had made sure that he was dead, they walked swiftly away. They wore masks, and their numbers could not be seen. They were either picked off or covered. But if the victim's neighbors should recognize them by their general appearance, so far from hurrying to volunteer information, they would not now give in, even under interrogation, even under threat from the godfathers, but would repeat over and over again, No, I don't know anything. I didn't see anything." And this was not simply in recognition of a hoary truth known to all the oppressed. What you don't know can't hurt you. It was self-preservation, because anyone who gave names would have been killed next 5 a.m. and the security officer's goodwill would have been no help to him at all. And so murder, although as yet there had been fewer than a dozen, became the rule, became a normal occurrence. Anybody been killed today? Prisoners would ask each other when they went out to wash or collect their morning rations. In this cruel sport, the prisoner's ear heard the subterranean gong of justice. Out of 5,000 men, about a dozen were killed. But with every stroke of the knife, more and more of the clinging, twining tentacles fell away. A remarkable fresh breeze was blowing. On the surface, we prisoners living in a camp just as before, but in reality, we had become free. Free because for the very first time in our lives, we had started saying openly and aloud all that we thought. No one who has not experienced this transition can imagine what it is like. An invisible balance hung in the air. In one of its scales, all the familiar phantoms were heaped. Interrogation officers, punches, beatings, sleepless standing, boxes, cells too small to sit or lie down in, cold, damp punishment cells, rats, bedbugs, tribunals, second and third sentences. But this could not all happen at once. This was a slow grinding bone mill. It could not devour all of us at once and process us in a single day. And even when they had been through it, as every one of us had, men still went on existing. While in the other scale lay nothing but a single knife. But that knife was meant for you, if you gave in. It was meant for you alone, in the breast, and not sometime or other, but at dawn tomorrow, and all the forces of the Cheka MGB could not save you from it. It was not a long one, but just right for neat insertion between your ribs. It didn't even have a proper handle, just a piece of old insulation tape wound around the blunt end of the blade. But this gave a very good grip, so that the knife would not slip out of hand. And this bracing threat weighed heavier, so that now the bosses were suddenly blind and deaf. The information machine on which alone the fame of the omnipotent and omniscient organs had been based in decades past had broken down. Foremen started escaping into the disciplinary barracks, hiding behind stone walls. Not only they, but blood-sucking work assigners, stoolies on the brink of exposure, or, something told them, next on the list, suddenly took fright and ran for it. This was a new period, a heady and spine-tingling period in the life of the special camp. It wasn't we who had taken to our heels. They had, ridding us of their presence. A time such as we had never experienced or thought possible on this earth, when a man with an unclean conscience could not go quietly to bed. Retribution was at hand, not in the next world, not before the court of history, but retribution live and palpable, raising a knife over you in the light of dawn. It was like a fairy tale. The ground is soft and warm under the feet of honest men, but under the feet of traitors it prickles and burns. The masters of our bodies and souls were particularly anxious not to admit that our movement was political in character. In their menacing orders, warders went around the huts reading them out, the new trend was declared to be nothing but gangsterism. This made it all simpler, more comprehensible, somehow cozier. It seemed only yesterday that they had sent us gangsters labeled politicals. Well, politicals, real politicals for the first time, had now become gangsters. It was announced, not very confidently, that these gangsters would soon be discovered. So far not one of them had been. And still less confidently, that they would be shot. The orders further appealed to the prisoner mass to condemn the gangsters and struggle against them. The prisoners listened and went away chuckling. Seeing the disciplinary officers afraid to call political behavior by its name, we were aware of their weakness. The orders were of no avail. The prisoner masses did not start condemning and struggling on behalf of their masters. The next measure was to put the whole camp on a punitive routine. The object of the camp administration was to make things so hard for us that we would betray the murderers out of exasperation. But we braced ourselves to suffer, to hang on a bit. It was worth it. Their other object was to keep the huts closed so that murderers could not come from outside, and so would be easier to find. But another murder took place, and still no one was caught, just as no one had ever seen anything or knew anything. Then somebody's head was smashed in at work. Locked huts are no safeguard against that. They revoked the punitive regime. Instead, they had the bright idea of building the Great Wall of China. This was a wall 2 bricks thick and 4 meters high to cut across the width of the camp. They were preparing to divide the camp into 2 parts. We greatly resented that wall. We knew that the bosses had some dirty trick in store, but we had no choice but to build it. Only a little of us was as yet free, in our heads and our mouths, but we were still stuck up to our shoulders in the quagmire of slavery. 2 warders came into a hut after work and casually told a man, "Get ready and come with us." The prisoner looked around at the other lads and said, "I'm not going." In fact, this simple everyday situation, a snatch and a rest, which we had never resisted, which we were used to accepting fatalistically, held another possibility, that of saying, "I'm not going." Our liberated heads understood that now. The warders pounced on him. "What do you mean, not going?" "I'm just not going," the Zek answered firmly. "I'm all right where I am." There were shouts from all around. "Where's he supposed to go? What's he got to go for? We won't let you take him. We won't let you. Go away." And the wolves understood that we were not the sheep we used to be, that if they wanted to grab one of us now, they would have to use trickery, or do it at the guardhouse, or send a whole detail to take one prisoner. With a crowd around, they would never take him. Purged of human filth, delivered from spies and eavesdroppers, we looked about and saw, wide-eyed, that we were thousands, that we were politicals, that we could resist. We had chosen well. The chain would snap if we tugged at this link. The stoolies, the tale-bearers, and traitors. Our own kind had made our lives impossible. As on some ancient sacrificial altar, their blood had been shed that we might be freed from this curse that hung over us. The revolution was gathering strength. The wind that seemed to have subsided had sprung up again in a hurricane to fill our eager lungs. End of Part 5, Chapter 10. Part 5, Chapter 11. Tearing at the Chains. The middle ground is now collapsed. The ditch which ran between us and our custodians was now a deep moat, and we stood on opposite slopes, taking measure of the situation. Stood is, of course, a manner of speaking. We went to work daily. We were never late for work line-up. We never let each other down. There were no shirkers. We chalked up a good day's work. You might think that our masters could be pleased with us. All the same, we and they were thinking hard about the next stage. Things could not remain as they were. We could not be satisfied with what had happened, nor could they. Someone had to strike a blow. But what should be our aim? We could now say out loud, without looking nervously around, whatever we liked, all those things which had seethed inside us, and freedom of speech, even if it was only there in camp, even though it had come so late, was a delight. But could we hope to spread that freedom beyond camp, or carry it out with us? Of course not. We, from where we were, could not demand that the country should change completely, nor that it should give up the camps. They would have rained bombs on us. As to whether we should fight for an 8-hour working day, there was no unanimity among us. We were so unused to freedom that we seemed to have lost all appetite for it. Ways and means were also discussed. How should we present our demands? What actions should we take? Clearly, we could do nothing with bare hands against modern arms, and therefore the course for us to take was not armed rebellion, but a strike. But the blood in our veins was still slavish, still servile. The word strike sounded so terrifying to our ears that we sought firmer ground. by refusing food when we refused to work, it seemed to us that our moral right to strike would be reinforced. We felt that we had some sort of right to go on a hunger strike, but to strike in the ordinary sense? So that by voluntarily undertaking an unnecessary hunger strike, we voluntarily agreed to undermine the physical strength which we needed for the struggle. Fortunately, no other camp seems to have repeated Ekibastez's mistake. We went over and over the details of the proposed work stoppage hunger strike. It was talked over in various places, in one group and another. It seemed inevitable and desirable, yet, because it was so novel, somehow impossible. But our custodians were less likely to lose by acting than by failing to act, and they got their blow in first. After that, events took on a momentum of their own. At peace and ease on our familiar bunks, in our familiar sections, we greeted the new year, 1952. Then on Sunday, January 6th, the Orthodox Christmas Eve, when the Ukrainians were getting ready to observe the holiday in style, they would make kutia, fast till the first star appeared, and then sing carols. The doors were locked after morning inspection, and not opened again. So that was it, a regrouping. Guards were posted by the break in the Chinese wall. It would be bricked up by next day. We were taken past the guardhouse and herded, hundreds of us, with sacks and mattresses like refugees from a burning village, around the boundary fence, past another guardhouse, into the other camp area, passing those who were being driven in the opposite direction. In one half of the camp, Camp Division No. 2, only the Ukrainian nationalists, some 2,000 of them, were left. In the half to which we had been driven, which was to be Camp Division No. 1, there were some 3,500 men belonging to all the other ethnic groups: Russians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Tatars, Caucasians, Georgians, Armenians, Jews, Poles, Moldavians, Germans, and a variegated sprinkling of other nationalities. The Ukrainians, Banderists, the most dangerous rebels, had been moved farther away from it. What did this mean? We soon learned what. Reliable rumors went around camp, from the working prisoners who took the gruel to the BUR, that the stoolies in the safe deposit had grown cheeky. Suspects, picked up here and there, 2 or 3 at a time, had been put in with the stoolies, who were torturing them in their common cell, choking them, beating them, trying to make them sing, and to name names. Who was doing the slashing? This made the whole scheme as clear as daylight. They were using torture. Not the dog pack themselves. They probably had no authorization for it, and might run into trouble, so they had entrusted the stoolies with the job. Find your murderers yourselves. So many deep historians have written so many clever books, and still they have not learned how to predict those mysterious conflagrations of the human spirit, to detect the mysterious springs of a social explosion, nor even to explain them in retrospect. Sometimes you can stuff bundle after bundle of burning tow under the logs, and they will not take. Yet up above, a solitary little spark flies out from the chimney, and the whole village is reduced to ashes. Our 3,000 had no plans made, were quite unprepared, but one evening on their return from work, the prisoners in a hut next to the BUR began dismantling their bunks, seizing the long bars and cross pieces, ran through the gloom to batter down the stout fence around the camp jail. They had neither axes nor crowbars. There was a hammering noise. They worked like a team of good carpenters, levering the planks away as soon as they gave, and the grating protests of 12-centimeter nails could be heard all over the camp. The warders hustled over to the BUR, to the half-dark wall where all the activity was, and raced like scalded cats to the staff barracks. Somebody rushed over a warder with a stick. Then, to provide full musical accompaniment, somebody started breaking windows in the staff barracks with stones or a stick. The staff's window panes shattered with a merry menacing crash. What the lads had in mind was not to raise a rebellion, nor even to capture the BUR, no easy matter, but merely to pour petrol into the stoolie's cell and toss in something burning, meaning, "Watch your step, we'll show you yet." But machine gun fire from the towers suddenly rattled across the camp, and they never did start their blaze. The warders and the chief disciplinary officer, Machakovsky, had fled from the camp and informed Division. Division gave telephonic instructions for the corner towers to open fire from machine guns on 3,000 unarmed people who knew nothing of what had happened. Our team, for instance, was in the mess hall and were completely mystified when we heard all the shooting outside. Firing at random in the darkness, the machine gunners blasted away. They pierced the flimsy walls of the huts and, as always happens, wounded not those who had stormed the BUR, but others who had no part in it. In hut number 9, a harmless old man nearing the end of a 10-year sentence was killed in his bed. He was due to be released in a month's time. The besiegers left the prison yard and quickly dispersed to their barracks, where they had to put their bunks together again so as to cover their traces. Many others took the shouting as a warning to stay inside their huts, yet others, on the contrary, poured out excitedly and scurried about the camp, trying to understand what it was all about. By then there were no warders left in the camp area. The staff barracks was empty of officers, and terrible jagged holes yawned in its windows. The towers were silent. The curious and the seekers after truth roamed the camp. Suddenly the gates of our camp division were flung wide and a platoon of convoy troops marched in with Tommy guns at the ready, firing short bursts at random. They fanned out in all directions, and behind them came the enraged warders with links of iron pipe, clubs, or anything else they had been able to lay their hands on. A lethal crush developed at the entrance to our hut. The prisoners were so anxious to shove their way in that no one could enter. Not that the thin boards of the hut walls gave any protection against bullets, but once inside, a man ceased to be a mutineer. I was one of those by the steps. I remember very well my state of mind, a nauseated indifference to my fate, a momentary indifference whether I survived or not. Why have you fastened your hooks on us, curse you? Why must we go on paying you till the day we die for the crime of being born into this unhappy world? Why must we sit forever in your jails? The prison sickness which is at once nausea and peace of mind flooded my being. Even my constant fear for the as yet unrecorded poem and the play I carried within me was in abeyance. In full view of the death which was wheeling toward us in military greatcoats, I made no effort at all to push through the door. This was the true convict mentality. This is what they had brought us to. Our pursuers did not break into the huts. They locked us in. They hunted down and beat those who had not been quick enough to run inside. The work stoppage hunger strike had not been carefully prepared. It was not even a coherent concept, and it began impulsively, with no directing center, no signal system. Those prisoners in other camps who took over the food stores and then stayed away from work, of course behaved more sensibly. But our action, if not very clever, was impressive. 3,000 men simultaneously swore off both food and work. Next morning, not a single team sent its man to the bread-cutting room. Not a single team went to the mess hall, where broth and mush awaited them. The warders just could not understand it. Twice, 3 times, 4 times, they came into the huts to summon us with brisk commands, then to drive us out with threats, then to ask us nicely. No farther than to the mess hall to collect our bread, with never a word for the present about work line-up. But nobody went. They all lay on their bunks, fully dressed, wearing their shoes, and silent. Only we, the foremen, I had become a foreman in that hot year, felt called upon to answer, since the warders kept addressing themselves to us. We lay on our bunks like the rest and muttered from our pillows, "It's no good, boss." This unanimous, quiet defiance of a power which never forgave, this obstinate, painfully protracted insubordination, was somehow more frightening than running and yelling as bullets fly. In the end, they stopped coaxing us and locked up the huts. In the days that followed, no one left in the huts, except the orderlies, to carry the latrine buckets out and bring drinking water and coal in. Only bed cases in the medical section were, by general agreement, allowed not to fast. The bosses could no longer see us, no longer peer into our souls. A gulf had opened up between the overseers and the slaves. None of those who took part will ever forget those 3 days in our lives. We could not see our comrades in other huts, nor the corpses lying there unburied. Nonetheless, the bonds which united us at the opposite ends of the deserted camp were of steel. This was a hunger strike called not by well-fed people with reserves of subcutaneous fat, but by gaunt, emaciated men who had felt the whip of hunger daily for years on end, who had achieved with difficulty some sort of physical equilibrium, and who suffered acute distress if they were deprived of a single 100-gram ration. Even the goners starved with the rest, although a 3-day fast might tip them into irreversible and fatal decline. The food which we had refused, and which we had always thought so beggarly, was a mirage of plenty in the feverish dreams of famished men. This was a hunger strike called by men schooled for decades in the law of the jungle. You die first, and I'll die later. Now they were reborn. They struggled out of their stinking swamp. They consented to die today, all of them together, rather than go on living in the same way tomorrow. In the huts, roommates began to treat each other with a sort of ceremonious affection. Whatever scraps of food anyone, this meant mainly those who received parcels, had left were pooled, placed on a piece of rag spread out like a tablecloth, and then, by joint decision of the whole room, some eatables were shared out and others put aside for the next day. What the bosses would do, no one could predict. We thought that perhaps they would start firing on the huts again from the towers. The last thing we expected was any concession. We had never in our lives wrested anything from them, and our strike had the bitter tang of hopelessness. But there was a sort of satisfaction in this feeling of hopelessness. We had taken a futile, a desperate step. It could only end badly, and that was good. Our bellies were empty, our hearts were in our boots, but some higher need was being satisfied. During those long, hungry days, evenings, nights, 3,000 men brooded over their 3,000 sentences, their families, their lack of families, all that had befallen and would yet befall them. And although the hearts in thousands of breasts could not beat together, and there were those who felt only regret, only despair, yet most of them kept time. Things are as they should be. We'll keep it up to spite you. Things are bad. So much the better. This, too, is a phenomenon which has never been adequately studied. We do not know the law that governs sudden surges of mass emotion in defiance of all reason. I felt this soaring emotion myself. I had only 1 more year of my sentence to serve. I might have been expected to feel nothing but dismay and vexation that I was dirtying my hands on a broil which I could hardly escape without a new sentence. And yet I had no regrets. Damn and blast the lot of you. I'll serve my time all over again if you like. Next day we saw from our windows a group of officers making their way from hut to hut. A detail of warders opened the door, went along the corridors, looked into the rooms, and called us, not in the old way, as though we were cattle, but gently. "Foreman, you're wanted at the entrance." A debate began among us. It was the teams, not their foreman, who had to decide. Men went from room to room to talk it over. A decision was reached at last in some invisible quarter. We foremen, 6 or 7 of us, went out to the entrance, where the officers were patiently awaiting us. We lowered our eyes because not one of us could now look at our bosses sycophantically, and rebellious looks would have been foolish. From both corridors, however, a crowd of Zeks pressed into the entranceway, and hiding behind those in front, the back rows could speak freely, call out our demands and our answers. Officially, the officers with the blue-edged epaulets, some we knew, others we had never seen before, saw and addressed only the foreman. Their manner was restrained. They did not try to intimidate us, but their tone was still intended to remind us that we were inferior. It would, so they said, be in our own interest to end the strike and the hunger strike. If we did, we would receive not only today's rations, but, something unheard of in Gulag, yesterday's, too. They were so used to the idea that hungry men can always be bought. There were shouts from the corridor. "Whoever's to blame for the shooting must be brought to justice. Take the locks off the doors. Off with the numbers." The bosses left, and the hut was locked up again. Although the hunger had begun to get many of us down, our heads were heavy and our thoughts lacked clarity, in our hut not a single voice was raised in favor of surrender. For the second night, the third morning, and the third day, hunger clawed at our guts. But then on the third morning, the Chekists, in still greater force, again summoned the foreman to the entrance, and once again we stood there, sullen, unreachable, hangdog. Our general resolve was not to give way. We were carried along by inertial force. The bosses only gave us new strength. The newly arrived brass hat had this to say: "The administration of the Pesheni camp requests the prisoners to take their food. The administration will receive any complaints. It will examine them and eliminate the causes of conflict between the administration and the prisoners." Had our ears deceived us? They were requesting us to take food, and not so much as a word about work. We had stormed the camp jail, broken windows and lamps, chased warders with knives, and it now turned out that far from being a mutiny, this was a conflict between equals, between the administration and the prisoners. It had only taken 2 days and 2 nights of united action, and look how our serf masters had changed their tone. Never in our lives, not only as prisoners, but as free men, as members of trade unions, had we heard our bosses speak with such unction. Nonetheless, we started silently dispersing. No one could take a decision there, nor could anyone there promise a decision. The hut was locked again. From outside it looked to the bosses as dumb and unyielding as ever, but inside the sections were the scene of a stormy debate. The temptation was too great. Soft speech had affected the undemanding Zeks more than any threat would. Voices were heard urging surrender. What more, indeed, could we hope to achieve? We were tired. We were hungry. The mysterious force which had fused our emotions and borne us aloft was losing height, and with tremulous wings bringing us down to earth again. Yet mouths clamped tight for decades, mouths which had been silent for a lifetime, were now opened. Give way now? That would mean accepting someone's word of honor. Whose word exactly? That of our jailers, the camp dog pack. In all the time that prisons had existed, in all the time the camps had been there, had they ever once kept their word? The sentiment of ancient sufferings and wrongs and insults was stirred up anew. For the first time ever we had taken the right road. Were we to give in so soon? For the first time we had felt what it was like to be human, only to give in so quickly. A keen, brazen breeze of mischief blew around us. We would go on, we would go on. They'd sing a different tune before we finished. They would give way. Once more the emotions of 200 men were fused in a single passion. The wings of an eagle beat the air. He sailed aloft. We lay down to conserve our strength, trying to move as little as possible and not to talk unnecessarily. Our thoughts were quite enough to occupy us. Suddenly, in the late afternoon of the third day, when the western sky was clearing and the setting sun could be seen, our observers shouted in anger and dismay, "Hut 9! 9 has surrendered! 9's going to the mess hall!" We all jumped up. Prisoners from the other side of the corridor ran into our room. Through the bars, from the upper and lower bed platforms, some of us on all fours, some looking over other people's shoulders, we watched, transfixed, that sad procession. 250 pathetic little figures, darker than ever against the sunset, cowed and crestfallen, were trailing slantwise across the camp. On they went, each of them glimpsed briefly in the rays of the setting sun, a dawdling, endless chain, as though those behind regretted that the foreman had set out, and were loath to follow. Some, feebler than the rest, were led by the arm or the hand, and so uncertain were their steps that they looked like blind men with their guides. Many, too, held mess tins or mugs in their hands, and this mean prison ware, carried in expectation of a supper too copious to gulp down onto constricted stomachs, these tins and cups held out like begging bowls, were more degrading and slavish and pitiable than anything else about them. I felt myself weeping. I glanced at my companions as I wiped away my tears, and saw theirs. Hut number 9 had spoken and decided for us all. It was there that the dead had been lying around for 4 days, since Tuesday evening. They went into the mess hall, and it was as though they had decided to forgive the murderers in return for their bread ration and some mush. We went away from the windows without a word. It was then that I learned the meaning of Polish pride, and understood their recklessly brave rebellions. The Polish engineer Jerzy Wagurski, whom I have mentioned before, was now in our team. He was serving his 9th and last year. Even when he was a work assigner, no one had ever heard him raise his voice. He was always quiet, polite, and gentle. But now, his face was distorted with rage, scorn, and suffering, as he tore his eyes away from that procession of beggars and cried in an angry, steely voice, "Foreman, don't wake me for supper. I shan't be going." He clambered up onto the top bunk, turned his face to the wall, and didn't get up again. That night we went to eat, but he wouldn't get up. He never received parcels. He was quite alone. He was always short of food, but he wouldn't get up. In his mind's eye, the steam from a bowl of mush could not veil the ideal of freedom. If we had all been so proud and so strong, what tyrant could have held out against us? But what had happened had not gone for nothing, and our comrades had not fallen in vain. The atmosphere in the camp would never be as oppressive as before. Meanness was back on its throne, but very precariously. Politics were freely discussed in the huts. No work assigner or foreman would dare kick a Zek or take a swing at him, because everybody knew how easy it is to make knives and how easily they sink home between the ribs. Our little island had experienced an earthquake and ceased to belong to the archipelago. This was how Ekibastas felt. It is doubtful whether Karaganda felt the same, and certain that Moscow did not. The special camp system was beginning to collapse in one place after another, but our father and teacher had no inkling of it. Meanwhile, the germ of freedom was spreading. Like a legend in chains, our movement entered still servile Kengir to awaken it, too. There were other disturbances besides ours, besides those in the special camps, but the whole bloody past had been so carefully cleaned up and painted and polished that it was impossible for me to now establish even a bare list of disorders in the camps. Evidently, the Stalinist camp system, particularly the special camps, was nearing a crisis at the beginning of the 50s. Even in the Almighty One's lifetime, the natives were beginning to tear at their chains. There is no knowing how things would have gone if he had lived. As it was, for reasons which had nothing to do with the laws of economics or society, the sluggish and impure blood suddenly stopped flowing in the senile veins of that undersized and pockmarked individual. However, the tyrant did not die in vain. Something hidden from view slipped and shifted, and suddenly, with a tinny clatter like an empty bucket falling, yet another individual came tumbling headlong from the very top of the ladder into the muckiest of bogs. And now everyone, the vanguard, the rear, even the most wretched natives of Gulag, realized that a new age had arrived. To us on the archipelago, Beria's fall was like a thunderclap. He was the supreme patron, the viceroy of the archipelago. MVD officers were perplexed, embarrassed, dismayed. "It's all over now," Colonel Chekhov said with quivering lips. But he was mistaken. End of Part 5, Chapter 11. Part 5, Chapter 12. The 40 Days of Kengir. For the special camps, there was another side to Beria's fall. By raising their hopes, it confused, distracted, and disarmed the Katorga. Hopes of speedy change burgeoned, their anger cooled. In that fateful year, 1953, the fall of Beria made it urgent for the Security Ministry to prove its devotion and its usefulness in some signal way. But how? The mutinies which the security men had hitherto considered a menace now shone like a beacon of salvation. Let's have more disturbances and disorders, so that measures will have to be taken. Then staffs and salaries will not be reduced. In less than a year, the guards at Kenjir opened fire several times on innocent men, and it cannot have been unintentional. They shot Lida, the young girl from the mortar-mixing gang who hung her stockings out to dry near the boundary fence. They winged the old Chinaman. Nobody in Kenjir remembered his name, and he spoke hardly any Russian, but everybody knew the waddling figure with a pipe between his teeth and the face of an elderly goblin. A guard called him to a watchtower, tossed a packet of makorka near the boundary fence, and when the Chinaman reached for it, shot and wounded him. Then there was the famous case of the column returning to camp from the ore-dressing plant and being fired on with dum-dum bullets, which wounded 16 men. This the Zaks did not take quietly. It was the Ekibista's story all over again. Kenjir Camp Division No. 3 did not turn out for work 3 days running, but did take food, demanding punishment of the culprits. A commission arrived and persuaded them that the culprits would be prosecuted. They went back to work. But in February 1954, another prisoner was shot at the woodworking plant. The evangelist, as all Kenjir remembered him, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, I think his name was. This man had served 9 years and 9 months of his tenure. His job was fluxing arc welding rods, and he did his work in a little shed which stood near the boundary fence. He went out to relieve himself near the shed, and while he was at it, was shot from a watchtower. Guards quickly ran over from the guardhouse and started dragging the dead man into the boundary zone to make it look as though he had trespassed on it. This was too much for the Zaks, who grabbed picks and shovels and drove the murderers away from the murdered man. The woodworking plant was in an uproar. The prisoners said that they would carry the dead man into camp on their shoulders. The camp officers would not permit it. "Why did you kill him?" shouted the prisoners. The bosses had their explanation ready. The dead man himself was to blame. He had started it by throwing stones at the tower. Can they have had time to read his identity card? Did they know that he had 3 months more to go and was an evangelical Christian? In the evening after supper, what they did was this. The light would suddenly go out in a section, and somebody invisible said from the doorway, "Brothers, how long shall we go on building and taking our wages in bullets? Nobody goes to work tomorrow." The same thing happened in section after section, hut after hut. A note was thrown over the wall to the 2nd Camp Division. In this division, which was multinational, the majority had tenors, and many were coming to the end of their time, but they joined in just the same. In the morning, the men's camp divisions, 2 and 3, did not report for work. This bad habit, striking without refusing the state's bread and slops, was becoming more and more popular with prisoners. They held out like this for 2 days, but the strike was mastered. For the second time in Kenjir, a ripening abscess was lanced before it could burst. But then the bosses went too far. They reached for the biggest stick they could use on the 58s. For the thieves. The bosses now renounced the whole principle of the special camps, acknowledged that if they segregated political prisoners, they had no means of making themselves understood, and brought into the mutinous No. 3 Camp Division 650 men, most of them thieves, some of them petty offenders, including many minors. "A healthy batch is joining us," the bosses spitefully warned the 58s. "Now you won't dare breathe." The bosses understood well enough how the restorers of order would begin, by stealing, by preying on others, and so setting every man against his fellows. But here again we see how unpredictable is the course of human emotions and of social movements. Injecting in Kenjir No. 3 a mammoth dose of tested ptomaine, the bosses obtained not a pacified camp, but the biggest mutiny in the history of the Gulag Archipelago. Events followed their inevitable course. It was impossible for the politicals not to offer the thieves a choice between war and alliance. It was impossible for the thieves to refuse an alliance. And it was impossible for the alliance, once concluded, to remain inactive. The obvious first objective was to capture the service yard, in which all the camp's food stores were also situated. They began the operation in the afternoon of a non-working day, Sunday, May 16, 1954. All these quite undisguised operations took a certain time, during which the warders managed to get themselves organized and obtain instructions. The service yard was now firmly held by the punitive forces, and machine gunners were posted there. But the 2nd Camp Division erected a barricade facing the service yard gate. The 2nd and 3rd Camp Divisions had been joined together by a hole in the wall, and there were no longer any warders, any MVD authority in them. How can we say what feelings wrung the hearts of those 8,000 men, who for so long and until yesterday had been slaves with no sense of fellowship, and now had united and freed themselves, not fully perhaps, but at least within the rectangle of those walls, and under the gaze of those quadrupled guards? So long suppressed, the brotherhood of man had broken through at last. Proclamations appeared in the mess hall. Arm yourselves as best as you can, and attack the soldiers first. The most passionate among them hastily scrawled their slogans on scraps of newspaper. Bash the Chekists, boys. Death to the Stoolies, the Chekkas stooges. Here, there, everywhere you turned, there were meetings and orators. Everybody had suggestions of his own. What demands shall we put forward? What is it we want? Put the murderers on trial. Goes without saying. What else? No locking huts. Take the numbers off. But beyond that came the most frightening thing, the real reason why they had started it all. What they really wanted. We want freedom, of course. Just freedom. But who can give it to us? The judges who condemn us in Moscow. As long as our complaints are against Steplag or Karaganda, they will go on talking to us. But if we start complaining against Moscow, we'll all be buried in this steppe. Well then, what do we want? To break holes in the walls? To run off in the wilderness? Those hours of freedom, immense chains had fallen from our arms and shoulders. No, whatever happened, there could be no regrets. That one day made it all worthwhile. Late on Monday, a delegation from the Command HQ arrived in the seething camp. The delegation was quite well disposed. Our side learned that the generals had flown in from Moscow. They found the prisoners' demands fully justified. We simply gasped. Justified? We aren't rebels, then? No, they're quite justified. Those responsible for the shooting will be made to answer for it. But why did they beat up women? Beat up women? The delegation was shocked. That can't be true. Anya Mikhailovich brought in a succession of battered women for them to see. The commission was deeply moved. We'll look into it, never fear. Beasts! Lyuba Bershetskaya's shouts at the general. There were other shouts. No locks on the huts. We won't lock them anymore. Take the numbers off. Certainly we'll take them off. The holes in the wall between the camp areas must remain. They were getting bolder. We must be allowed to mix with each other. All right, mix as much as you like. Let the holes remain. Right, brothers, what else do we want? We've won. We raised hell for just one day, enjoyed ourselves, let off steam, and we won. Although some among us shake our heads and say, it's a trick, we believe it. We believe because that's our easiest way out of the situation. All that the downtrodden can do is go on hoping. After every disappointment, they must find fresh reason for hope. So on Tuesday, May 18, all Kenjir camp divisions went out to work, reconciling themselves to thoughts of their dead. That morning the whole affair could still have ended quietly, but the exalted generals assembled in Kenjir would have considered such an outcome a defeat for themselves. They could not seriously admit that prisoners were in the right. When the columns of prisoners returned to camp in the evening after giving a day's work to the state, they were hurried in to supper before they knew what was happening, so that they could be locked up quickly. On orders from the general, the jailers had to play for a time that first evening, that evening of blatant dishonesty after yesterday's promises. But before nightfall, the long-drawn whistles heard on Sunday shrilled through the camp again. The 2nd and 3rd camp divisions were calling to each other like hooligans on a spree. The warders took fright and fled from the campgrounds without finishing their duties. The camp was in the hands of the Zeks, but they were divided. The towers opened fire with machine guns on anyone who approached the inside walls. They killed several and wounded several. Once again, Zeks broke all the lamps with slingshots, but the towers lit up the camp with flares. They battered at the barbed wire and the new fence posts with long tables, but it was impossible under fire, either to break through the barrier or to climb over it, so they had to burrow under. As always, there were no shovels, except those for use in case of fire inside the camp. Kitchen knives and mess tins were put into service. That night, May 18 to 19th, they burrowed under all the walls and again united all the divisions and the service yard. The towers had stopped shooting now, and there were plenty of tools in the service yard. Under cover of night, they broke down the boundary fences, knocked holes in the walls, and widened the passages so that they would not become traps. That night they broke through the wall around the 4th Camp Division, the prison area too. The warders guarding the jails fled. The prisoners wrecked the interrogation offices. Among those from the jail were those who on the morrow would take command of the rising. Former Red Army Colonel Kapitan Kuznetsov and former First Lieutenant Gleb Slukenkov. Mutinous Zeks, these 8,000 men had not so much raised a rebellion as escaped to freedom, though not for long. 8,000 men, from being slaves, had suddenly become free, and now was their chance to live. Faces, usually grim, softened into kind smiles. Women looked at men, and men took them by the hand. Some who had corresponded by ingenious secret ways, without even seeing each other, met at last. Lithuanian girls whose weddings had been solemnized by priests on the other side of the wall now saw their lawful wedded husbands for the first time. The Lord had sent down to earth the marriages made into heaven. For the first time in their lives, no one tried to prevent the sectarians and believers from meeting for prayer. Foreigners, scattered about the camp divisions, now found each other and talked about this strange Asiatic revolution in their own languages. The camp's food supply was in the hands of the prisoners. No one drove them out to work line-up and an 11-hour working day. The morning of May 19 dawned over a feverishly sleepless camp which had torn off its number patches. Many took their street clothes from the storerooms and put them on. Some of the lads crammed fur hats on their heads. Shortly there would be embroidered shirts, and on the Central Asians bright-colored robes and turbans. The gray-black camp would be a blaze of color. Orderlies went around the huts, summoning us to the big mess hall to elect a commission for negotiations with the authorities and for self-government. For all they knew, they were electing it just for a few hours. But it was destined to become the government of Kenjir Camp for 40 days. The days ran on, and the generals were regretfully forced to conclude that the camp was not disintegrating of its own accord, and that there was no excuse to send troops in to the rescue. The camp stood fast, and the negotiations changed their character. Golden epauletted personages in various combinations continued coming into the camp to argue and persuade. They were all allowed in, but they had to pick up white flags and they had to undergo a body search. In return, the rebel staff guaranteed their personal safety. They showed the generals around wherever it was allowed, not, of course, around the secret sector of the service yard. Let them talk to prisoners, and called big meetings in the camp divisions for their benefit. Their epaulets flashing, the bosses took their seats in the presidium as of old, as though nothing were amiss. The discussions sometimes took the form of direct negotiations on the loftiest diplomatic model. Sometime in June, a long mess table was placed in the women's camp, and the golden epaulets seated themselves on a bench to one side of it, while the Tommy gunners allowed in with them as a bodyguard stood at their backs. Across the table, the members of the commission, and they too had a bodyguard, which stood there looking very serious, armed with sabers, pikes and slingshots. In the background, crowds of prisoners gathered to listen to the powwow and shout comments. Refreshments for the guests were not forgotten. The rebels had agreed on their demands, or requests, in the first 2 days, and now repeated them over and over again. Punish the evangelist's murderer. Punish all those responsible for the murders on Sunday night in the service yard. Punish those who beat up the women. Bring back those comrades who had been illegally sent to closed prisons for striking. No more number patches, window bars, or locks on hut doors. Inner walls between camp divisions not to be rebuilt. An 8-hour day, as for free workers. An increase in payment for work. Here there was no question of equality with free workers. Unrestricted correspondence with relatives, periodic visits. Although there was nothing unconstitutional in any of these demands, nothing that threatened the foundations of the state, indeed many of them were requests for a return to the old position, it was impossible for the bosses to accept even the least of them, because these bald skulls under service caps and supported by close-clipped fat necks had forgotten how to admit a mistake or a fault. Truth was unrecognizable and repulsive to them if it manifested itself not in secret instructions from higher authority, but on the lips of common people. Still, the obduracy of the 8,000 under siege was a blot on the reputation of the generals. It might ruin their careers, and so they made promises. They promised that nearly all the demands would be satisfied. They could hardly leave the women's camp open. That was against the rules, forgetting that in the corrective labor camps it had been that way for 20 years. But they could consider arranging, should they say, meeting days. To the demand that the Commission of Inquiry should start its work inside the camp, the generals unexpectedly agreed. But Shlukenkov guessed their purpose and refused to hear of it. While making their statements, the stoolies would expose everything that was happening in the camp. Review of cases? Well, of course cases would be re-examined, but prisoners would have to be patient. There was one thing that couldn't wait at all. The prisoners must get back to work, to work, to work. But the Zeks knew that trick by now, dividing them up into columns, forcing them to ground at gunpoint, arresting the ringleaders. No, they answered across the table and from the platform. No, shouted voices from the crowd. The administration of Steplag have behaved like provocateurs. We do not trust the Steplag authorities. We don't trust the MVD. Don't trust even the MVD? The vice minister was thrown into a sweat by this treasonable talk. And who can have inspired you in such hatred for the MVD? A riddle, if there ever was one. There were weeks when the whole war became a war of propaganda. The outside radio was never silent. Through several loudspeakers set up at intervals around the camp, it interlarded appeals to the prisoners with information and misinformation, and with a couple of trite and boring records that frayed everybody's nerves. Through the meadow goes a maiden, she whose braided hair I love. Still to be thought worthy even of that not very high honor. Having records played to them, they had to rebel. Even rubbish like that wasn't played for men on their knees. These records also served, in the spirit of the times, as a jamming device, drowning the broadcasts from the camps intended for the escort troops. On the outside radio, they sometimes tried to blacken the whole movement, asserting that it had been started with the sole aim of rape and plunder. At other times, they tried telling filthy stories about members of the commission. Then the appeals would begin again. Work, work! Why should the motherland keep you for nothing? By not going to work, you were doing enormous damage to the state. This was supposed to pierce the hearts of men doomed to eternal Katorga. Whole trainloads of coal are standing in the siding. There's nobody to unload it. Let them stand there, the Zeks laughed. You'll give way all the sooner. The technical department, however, gave as good as it got. 2 portable film projectors were found in the service yard. Their amplifiers were used for loudspeakers, less powerful, of course. than those of the other side. The fact that the camp had electricity and radio greatly surprised and troubled the bosses. They were afraid that the rebels might rig up a transmitter and start broadcasting news about their rising to foreign countries. The camp soon had its own announcers. Programs included the latest news and news features. There was also a daily wall newspaper with cartoons. Crocodile Tears was the name of a program ridiculing the anxiety of the MVD men about the fate of women whom they themselves had previously beaten up. But there was not enough power to put on programs for the only potential sympathizers to be found in Kenjir, the free inhabitants of the settlement, many of them exiles. It was they whom the settlement authorities were trying to fool, not by radio, but with rumors that bloodthirsty gangsters and insatiable prostitutes were ruling the roost inside the camp. That over there innocent people were being tortured and burned alive in furnaces. How could the prisoners call out through the walls to the workers 1 or 2 or 3 kilometers away? Brothers, we only want justice. We only want justice. They were murdering us for no crime of ours. They were treating us worse than dogs. Here are our demands. The thoughts of the technical department, since they had no chance to outstrip modern science, moved backward instead of to the science of past ages. Using cigarette paper, they pasted together an enormous air balloon. A bundle of leaflets was attached to the balloon, and slung underneath it was a brazier containing glowing coals, which sent a current of warm air into the dome of the balloon through an opening in its base. To the huge delight of the assembled crowd, if prisoners ever do feel happy, they are like children. The marvelous aeronautical structure rose and was airborne, but alas, the speed of the wind was greater than the speed of its ascent, and as it was flying over the boundary fence, the brazier caught on barbed wire. The balloon, denied its current of warm air, fell and burned to ashes, together with the leaflets. After this failure, they started inflating balloons with smoke. With a following wind, they flew quite well, exhibiting inscriptions in large letters to the settlement. Save the women and old men from being beaten. We demand to see a member of the Presidium. The guards started shooting at these balloons. Then some Chechen prisoners came to the technical department and offered to make kites. They are experts. They succeeded in sticking some kites together and paying out the string until they were over the settlement. There was a percussive device on the frame of each kite. When the kite was in a convenient position, the device scattered a bundle of leaflets, also attached to the kite. The kite flyers sat on the roof of a hut, waiting to see what would happen next. If the leaflets fell close to the camp, warders ran to collect them. If they fell farther away, motorcyclists and horsemen dashed after them. Whatever happened, they tried to prevent the free citizens from reading an independent version of the truth. The leaflets ended by requesting any citizen of Kenjir who found one to deliver it to the Central Committee. The kites were also shot at, but holing was less damaging to them than to the balloons. The enemy soon discovered that sending up counter-kites to tangle strings with them was cheaper than keeping a crowd of warders on the run. A war of kites in the second half of the 20th century, and all to silence a word of truth. In the meantime, the technical department was getting its notorious secret weapon ready. Let me describe it. Aluminum corner brackets for cattle troughs, produced in the workshops and awaiting dispatch, were packed with a mixture of sulfur scraped from matches and a little calcium carbide. When the sulfur was lit and the brackets thrown, they hissed and burned into little pieces. But neither these star-crossed geniuses nor the field staff in the bathhouse were to choose the hour, place, and form of the decisive battle. Some 2 weeks after the beginning of the revolt, on one of those dark nights, without a glimmer of light anywhere, thuds were heard at several places around the camp wall. This time it was not escaping prisoners or rebels battering it down. The wall was being demolished by the convoy troops themselves. In the morning it turned out that the enemy without had made about a dozen breaches in the wall, in addition to those already there and the barricaded gateway. Machine gun posts had been set up on the other side of the gaps to prevent the Zeks from pouring through them. This was, of course, the preliminary for an assault through the breaches, and the camp was a seething anthill as it prepared to defend itself. The rebel staff decided to pull down the inner walls and the mud brick outhouses, and to erect a second circular wall of their own, specially reinforced with stacks of brick where it faced the gaps, to give protection against machine gun bullets. How things have changed! The troops were demolishing the boundary wall, the prisoners were rebuilding it, and the thieves were helping with a clear conscience, not feeling that they were contravening their code. Additional defense posts now had to be established opposite the gaps, and every platoon assigned to a gap, which it must run to defend should the alarm be raised at night. The Zeks quite seriously prepared to advance against machine guns with pikes. There was one attack in the daytime. Tommy gunners were moved up to one of the gaps opposite the balcony of the Steplag Administration Building, which was packed with important personages holding cameras or even movie cameras. The soldiers were in no hurry. They merely advanced just far enough into the breach for the alarm to be given, whereupon the rebel platoons responsible for the defense of the breach rushed out to man their barricade, brandishing their pikes and holding stones and mud bricks. And then, from the balcony, movie cameras whirred and pocket cameras clicked, taking care to keep the Tommy gunners out of the picture. Disciplinary officers, prosecutors, party officials, and all the rest of them, party members to a man, of course, laughed at the bizarre spectacle of the impassioned savages with pikes. Well-fed and shameless, these grand personages mocked their starved and cheated fellow citizens from the balcony, and found it all very funny. Then warders, too, stole up to the gaps and tried to slip nooses with hooks over the prisoners, as though they were hunting wild animals or the abominable snowman, hoping to drag out a talker. But what they mainly counted on now were deserters, rebels with cold feet. The radio blared away. "Come to your senses. Those who come over will not be tried for mutiny." The commission's response over the camp radio was this: "Anybody who wants to run away can go right ahead, through the main gate if he likes. We are holding no one back." In all those weeks, only about a dozen men fled from the camp. Why? Surely the rest did not believe in victory. Were they not appalled by the thought of the punishment ahead? They were. Did they not want to save themselves for their families' sake? They did. They were torn, and thousands of them perhaps had secretly considered this possibility. But the social temperature on this plot of land had risen so high that if souls were not transmuted, they were purged of dross, and the sordid laws saying that we only live once, that being determines consciousness, and that every man's a coward when his neck is at stake, ceased to apply for that short time in that circumscribed place. The laws of survival and of reason told people that they must all surrender together or flee individually. But they did not surrender, and they did not flee. They rose to that spiritual plane from which executioners are told, "The devil take you for his own, torture us, savage us." And the operation, so beautifully planned to make prisoners scatter like rats through the gaps in the wall till only the most stubborn were left, who would then be crushed, this operation collapsed because its inventors had the mentality of rats themselves. No one supported the island of Kenjir. It was impossible by now to take off into the wilderness. The garrison was being steadily reinforced. The whole camp had been encircled with a double barbed wire fence outside the walls. There was only one rosy spot on the horizon. The Lord and Master, they were expecting Malenkov, was coming to dispense justice, but it was too tiny a spot and too rosy. They could not hope for pardon. All they could do was live out their last days of freedom and submit to Steplag's vengeance. There are always hearts which cannot stand the strain. Some were already morally crushed, and were in an agony of suspense for the crushing proper to begin. Some quietly calculated that they were not really involved, and need not if they went on being careful. Some were newly married, What is more, with a proper religious ceremony, a Western Ukrainian girl, for instance, will not marry without one. And thanks to Gulag's thoughtfulness, there were priests of all religions there. For these newlyweds, the bitter and sweet succeeded each other with a rapidity which ordinary people never experience in their slow lives. They observed each day as their last, and retribution delayed was a gift from heaven each morning. The believers prayed, and leaving the outcome of the Kenji revolt in God's hands, were always the calmest of people. Services for all religions were held in the mess hall according to a fixed timetable. The Jehovah's Witnesses felt free to observe their rules strictly and refused to build fortifications or stand guard. They sat for hours on end with their heads together, saying nothing. They were made to wash the dishes. A prophet, genuine or sham, went around the camp putting crosses on bunks and foretelling the end of the world. Some knew that they were fatally compromised and that the few days before the troops arrived were all that was left of life. The theme of all their thoughts and actions must be how to hold out longer. These people were not the unhappiest. The unhappiest were those that were not involved and who prayed for the end. But when all these people gathered at meetings to decide whether to surrender or to hold on, they found themselves again in that heated climate where their personal opinions dissolved and ceased to exist even for themselves, or else they feared ridicule even more than the death that awaited them. And when they voted for or against holding out, the majority were for. Why did it drag on so long? What can the bosses have been waiting for? For the food to run out? They knew it would last a long time. Were they considering opinion in the settlement? They had no need to. Were they carefully working out their plan of repression? They could have been quicker about it. Were they having to seek approval for the operation up top? How high up? There is no knowing on what date and at what level the decision was taken. On several occasions, the main gate of the service yard suddenly opened, perhaps to test the readiness of the defenders. The duty picket sounded the alarm, and the platoons poured out to meet the enemy, but no one entered the campgrounds. In the middle of June, several tractors appeared in the settlement. They were working, shifting something perhaps, around the boundary fence. They began working even at night. The unfriendly roar made the night seem blacker. And suddenly the skeptics were put to shame, and the defeatists, and all those who said that there would be no mercy, and that there was no point in begging. The Orthodox alone could feel triumphant. On June 22nd, the outside radio announced that the prisoners' demands had been accepted. A member of the Presidium of the Central Committee was on his way. The rosy spot turned into a rosy sun, a rosy sky. Is it then possible to get through to them? There is, then, justice in our country. They will give a little, and we will give a little. If it comes to it, we can walk about with number patches, and the bars on the windows needn't bother us. We aren't thinking of climbing out. You say they're tricking us again? Well, they aren't asking us to report for work beforehand. Just as the touch of a stick will draw off the charge from an electroscope so that the agitated gold leaf sinks gratefully to rest, so did the radio announcement reduce the brooding tension of that last week. Even the loathsome tractors, after working for a while on the evening of June 24th, stopped their noise. Prisoners could sleep peacefully on the 40th night of the revolt. He would probably arrive tomorrow. Perhaps he had come already. In the early dawn of Friday, June 25th, parachutes carrying flares opened out into the sky. More flares soared from the watchtowers, and the observers on the rooftops were picked off by snipers' bullets before they could let out a squeak. Then cannon fire was heard. Airplanes skimmed the camp, spreading panic. Tanks, the famous T-34s, had taken up position under cover of the tractor noise and now moved on the gaps from all sides. One of them, however, fell into a ditch. Some of the tanks dragged concatenations of barbed wire on the trestles so that they could divide up the campgrounds immediately. Behind others ran helmeted assault troops with Tommy guns. Both Tommy gunners and tank crews had been given vodka first. However special the troops may be, it is easier to destroy unarmed and sleeping people with drink inside you. Operators with walkie-talkies came in with the advancing troops. The generals went up into the towers with the snipers, and from there, in the daylight shed by the flares, and a light from a tower set on fire by the Zeks with their incendiary bombs, gave their orders, "Take hut number so-and-so." The camp woke up, frightened out of its wits. Some stayed where they were in their huts, lying on the floor as their one chance of survival, and because the resistance seemed senseless. Others tried to make them get up and join in the resistance. Yet others ran into the line of fire, either to fight or to seek a quicker death. The 3rd Camp Division fought, the division which had started it all. They hurled stones at the Tommy gunners and warders, and probably sulfur bombs at the tanks. Nobody thought of the powdered glass. One hut counterattacked twice, with shouts of "Hurrah!" The tanks crushed everyone in their way. Alla Pressman from Kiev was run over. The tracks passed over her abdomen. Tanks rode up onto the porches of huts and crushed people there. The tanks grazed the sides of huts and crushed those who were clinging to them to escape the caterpillar tracks. Semyon Rak and his girl threw themselves under a tank clasped in each other's arms and ended it that way. Tanks nosed into the thin board walls of the huts and even fired blank shells into them. Fina Epstein remembers the corner of a hut collapsing, as if in a nightmare, and a tank passing obliquely over the wreckage and other living bodies. Women tried to jump and fling themselves out of the way. Behind the tank came a lorry, and the half-naked women were tossed out into it. The cannon shots were blank, but the Tommy guns were shooting live rounds, and the bayonets were cold steel. Women tried to shield men with their own bodies, and they, too, were bayoneted. Security Officer Belyaev shot 24 people with his own hand that morning. When the battle was over, he was seen putting knives into the hands of corpses for their photographer to take pictures of dead gangsters. Supran, a member of the commission and a grandmother, died from a wound in her lung. Some prisoners hid in the latrines and were riddled with bullets there. As a group of prisoners were taken, they were marched through the gaps onto every step between the files of Kenjir convoy troops outside. They were searched and made to lie flat on their faces and their arms stretched straight out. As they lay there thus crucified, MVD flyers and warders walked among them to identify and pull out those whom they had spotted earlier from the air or from the watchtowers. So busy were they with all this that no one had leisure to open Pravda that day. It had a special theme, a day in the life of our motherland, the successes of steelworkers. More and more crops harvested by machine. The historian surveying our country as it was that day will have an easy task. The victorious generals descended from the towers and went off to breakfast. Without knowing any of them, I feel confident that their appetite that June morning left nothing to be desired and that they drank deeply. An alcoholic hum would not in the least disturb the ideological harmony in their heads, and what they had for hearts was something installed with a screwdriver. The number of those killed or wounded was about 600, according to the stories, but according to figures given by the Kenjir Division's production planning section, which became known some months later, it was more than 700. All day on June 25th, the prisoners lay down on the steppe in the sun. For days on end, the heat had been unmerciful. While in the camp, there was endless searching and breaking open and shaking out. The members of the commission and other suspects were locked up in the camp jail. More than 1,000 people were selected for dispatch either to closed prisons or to Kolyma. As always, these lists were drawn up partly by guesswork, so that many who had not been involved at all found their way into them. May this picture of the pacification bring peace to the souls of those whom the last chapters have graded. On June 26th, the prisoners were made to spend the whole day taking down the barricades and bricking in the gaps. On June 27th, they were marched out to work. Those trains in the sidings would wait no longer for working hands. The tanks which had crushed Kenjir traveled under their own power to Rudnik and crawled around for the Zeks to see and draw their conclusions. End of Part 5.